the Queen of Mystery, and her grand tale of secrets. If T here is one name that has echoed through the annals of detective fiction, it is Agatha Christie. Known as the Queen of Mystery, her stories have captivated generations, weaving complex webs of intrigue, suspense, and human nature's darkest corners. Christie's works have earned her the distinction of being one of the best-selling authors of all time, and T here is no better testament to her enduring power than the novels that continue to mesmerize readers decades after they were first published. Her books have taken us into the drawing rooms of the wealthy, the bustling streets of cities, and the quiet corners of rural villages, always with a promise of a mystery waiting to be unraveled. But it is in her unique ability to create seemingly unsolvable puzzles, and the way she artfully peels back layers of character and motive, that Christie truly shines. She has mastered the art of not just crafting a mystery, but inviting the reader into a world of misdirection, drama, and astonishing revelations. Each twist, each turn, pulls the reader deeper into the labyrinth of her mind. And among the treasures of Christie's collection is one that brilliantly showcases this unmatched talent, the 1925 novel, The Secret of Chimneys. In The Secret of Chimneys, Christie does what she does best. She creates an atmospheric world filled with deception, secrets, and a motley crew of fascinating characters, all of whom seem to have something to hide. But this is more than just a murder mystery. It's a tale that mingles political intrigue, romance, and hidden histories, all while maintaining her signature wit and dark humor. What's more, Christie does not simply present a whodunit, but a whydunit where the reasons behind the crime are as compelling as the crime itself. The story unfolds at Chimneys, a sprawling estate nestled somewhere in the English countryside, with the kind of grandeur that invites both admiration and suspicion. But Chimneys is not your typical country house. It is a place of secrets, whispers of things hidden beneath its beautiful historic walls. And it is here, within this imposing estate, that a mystery as old as the house itself comes to life. The first question that graces the reader's mind is deceptively simple. What secrets lie within Chimneys? Is it the former grandeur of the estate, now slowly crumbling under the weight of its own history? Or is it the people who have passed through its halls, each carrying their own enigmatic burdens? The answer to that question will slowly unfold through the pages of Christie's tale, revealing that Chimneys, like the best of her stories, is far more than it seems at first glance. The plot begins with a seemingly mundane task, a job that anyone might accept. But in Christie's world, even the most ordinary of missions often conceals the most extraordinary of consequences. Enter Anthony Cade, a charming adventurer with a past full of mystery of his own. Cade's task is simple: deliver a memoir and a set of important documents to a publisher. The simplicity of the job stands in stark contrast to what it will eventually reveal: an entire web of conspiracy, murder, and political maneuvering. As Cade embarks on this seemingly innocuous errand, he soon finds himself caught up in something far darker than he could have imagined. But as with all of Christie's best works, The Secret of Chimneys is not merely about one man's journey into the unknown. It is a reflection of the world around him, world in the midst of political tension, where a European monarchy is struggling to stay afloat, and where every individual has something to gain or lose from the shifting balance of power. The memoir and documents Cade must deliver are part of a much larger puzzle, one that stretches far beyond the confines of Chimneys and its enigmatic inhabitants. What begins as a simple delivery soon morphs into something far more dangerous. A murder rocks the estate. Prince Michael of Czechoslovakia is found dead. And with the prince's death comes the realization that the political games of Europe have found their way to chimneys. Was it a random killing, a crime of passion, or is something far more insidious at play? The moment the prince's body is discovered, the house itself seems to take on a life of its own. With every creak of the floorboards, and every shadow cast by the flickering candles, the mansion whispers of long-buried secrets, of family legacies lost to time, and of power struggles that will stop at nothing to succeed. The guests at Chimneys are not just bystanders. They are players in a game whose stakes are far higher than anyone first realizes. Politicians, royalty, house staff, they all carry their own burdens, and it quickly becomes apparent that every one of them might be hiding something crucial. Christie's genius lies in her ability to turn each of these seemingly innocent characters into potential suspects, each one more complicated than the last. As the story progresses, the reader is never quite sure who can be trusted and who is merely playing a role in the grand conspiracy. Through it all, Christie masterfully blends elements of political intrigue with the classic murder mystery formula. But what truly sets The Secret of Chimneys apart is the way she mixes suspense with humor. The high-stakes drama of murder and conspiracy is punctuated by moments of witty dialogue and humorous observations, which breathe life into the characters and provide much-needed moments of levity in an otherwise tense environment. And then, there is the question that hangs over the entire narrative. What secrets are hidden within Chimneys itself? The estate is no mere backdrop. It is a character in its own right. Its sprawling grounds, its winding corridors, and its hidden passages all seem to hold the keys to the mystery. As the plot twists and turns, and as the investigation delves deeper into the heart of the estate, the house's own history, long forgotten by its present occupants, begins to resurface. Secrets from decades ago, buried beneath layers of time and history, are revealed. And with every revelation, the shadow of Chimneys grows darker. This novel is, at its core, a masterclass in suspense. Christie leads the reader down countless paths, only to pull them back with a sudden twist, forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The Murder at Chimneys is but the beginning. What lies behind it is a tale of political games, hidden identities, stolen treasures, and betrayals that span generations. The grand estate becomes more than just a setting. It becomes a symbol of everything the story is about: secrets, deception, and the lengths people will go to protect their own interests. In this grand web of political power, familial loyalty, and dangerous intrigue, the reader is left to wonder, is Chimneys just the stage for a single murder? Or is it the key to a far greater mystery that has yet to be uncovered? It is this question, posed in the opening pages, that pulls you in. Agatha Christie invites you into her world, one where nothing is as it seems, and every twist leaves you more captivated than the last. And in The Secret of Chimneys, she brings you a story that is as rich in its depth of intrigue as it is in the laughter and light-heartedness that punctuate the dark undertones. As you step into the world of Chimneys, be prepared for a journey that will keep you guessing until the very end. Because at Chimneys, nothing is ever quite what it seems. And sometimes the truth is buried deeper than you could ever imagine. There are few people in this world who have a knack for stumbling into the extraordinary while seemingly seeking the mundane. And if anyone fits that description, it's Anthony Cade. He was a man who had a way of turning the most unassuming tasks into the beginning of something far grander. To those who knew him, Anthony was a charming adventurer man whose wanderlust had taken him across continents, from the bustling streets of London to the exotic corners of Africa, and everywhere in between. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and immediately hold the attention of everyone in it, not because he was the loudest or most boisterous, but because there was an air of mystery about him. He exuded the type of quiet confidence that suggested he had lived through things most men only dreamed of, things he was not eager to discuss. But despite his reputation for charm, Anthony was not a man driven by ambition or fortune. He was, for the most part, a man of simple tastes, one who preferred the open road to the comforts of a stable home. It was perhaps this very lack of attachment that made him the ideal candidate for a job that would soon drag him into a world he never asked for. It began with a letter that would set Anthony on a path toward a mystery he could never have anticipated. The letter came from a man named Gregory B. Merton, a publisher with connections to the highest circles of European society. The message was brief, polite, and to the point. Anthony was to deliver a memoir and a set of important documents to Merton in London. The task sounded straightforward enough, so much so that it almost seemed too easy. For a man like Anthony, who had become accustomed to much more dangerous and complicated undertakings, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to relax, stretch his legs, and take in the sights of the city. But as always happens in Agatha Christie's world, appearances can be deceiving. The memoir, it seemed, was more than just the recollections of a man who had lived a colorful life. It was, in fact, a crucial piece of a puzzle that spanned nations, generations, and political intrigues far beyond Anthony's wildest imagination. The documents accompanying it were no ordinary letters. They were the keys to unlocking secrets that, if revealed, could change the course of European history. But Anthony had no way of knowing this when he first accepted the task. What started as a simple job quickly became anything but. As Anthony made his way to the publisher's office, something about the situation began to feel off. There was a sense of tension in the air, an unease that he couldn't quite place. His instincts, honed over years of adventure and risk, were telling him that there was more to this than met the eye. He had hardly set foot in the publisher's office when he was approached by a woman whose presence seemed to stir the very air around her. Her name was Virginia Revel, a woman of striking beauty, with dark hair that cascaded like a waterfall, and eyes that seemed to pierce through you, as though she could see every secret you'd ever kept. Virginia was no stranger to danger, nor was she unfamiliar with the world of secrets. She was, in fact, a woman whose own ties to a European monarchy were shrouded in mystery. And in that brief encounter with Anthony, it became immediately clear that her presence was no coincidence. Virginia's words were measured, but beneath them there was a palpable urgency. She was involved in something tied to the memoir Anthony had brought, something that extended beyond simple politics or royal affairs. The documents he had been asked to deliver were not just papers, they were the keys to a royal conspiracy that had remained hidden for decades. The intrigue only deepened as Anthony met more characters, each one more enigmatic than the last. Among them was a man named Colonel Race, a seasoned officer whose stoic exterior hid a sharp mind capable of discerning the slightest nuances in a person's behavior. There was also the rather peculiar figure of Count de la Rue, whose air of arrogance seemed to mask an uncanny knowledge of political maneuverings. And then there was the elusive and mysterious Sir Eustace Pedlar, a man whose sharp tongue and sharp mind gave him an air of authority and suspicion. As these players emerged, each one carrying their own carefully guarded secrets, Anthony began to realize that the task he had thought was simple was anything but. There were murmurs of a revolution, whispers of a long-lost European monarchy that was on the verge of being restored to power. And somewhere, hidden within these documents, was the truth that could either ensure the restoration of the monarchy or prevent it from ever happening. But it wasn't just the politics of Europe that made the situation dangerous. There was a palpable sense of danger in the air, a danger that came from knowing that someone, or perhaps many people, would stop at nothing to ensure that these secrets remained buried. Every person Anthony met seemed to be connected to this larger, darker game, and yet no one was quite willing to say just how deep they were involved. What had seemed like a simple delivery had quickly become a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. As Anthony delved deeper into the puzzle, the stakes grew higher, the danger more immediate, and the mystery more complicated. And in the midst of all of this, Virginia Revel remained a constant and enigmatic ally, whose own motives were as shrouded in secrecy as the story she was helping Anthony unravel. But the most dangerous game was yet to come. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Anthony found himself at the center of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the walls of London. What had begun as a task to deliver a few documents had now turned into something much darker, much more dangerous. Anthony was no longer just a messenger, was an unwilling player in a game of power, politics, and murder. And as the first hints of danger emerged, Anthony could not shake the feeling that something far greater was at play. This was no mere delivery. This was the beginning of something that would change everything. Chimneys was no ordinary estate. It was a sprawling country house, nestled on the edge of the English countryside, its very name invoking images of secrets long buried beneath its ivy-clad walls. The mansion stood at the heart of a vast, mist-filled estate, its looming silhouette cutting an imposing figure against the backdrop of rolling hills. There was something about the house, something ancient and proud, that suggested it had witnessed history in the making. And now, like an unwilling host to fate itself, Chimneys would soon bear witness to a new, darker chapter in its legacy. It was here, in this grand and enigmatic estate, that the story took its most thrilling turn. For Anthony Cade, the journey that began with a simple delivery had already led him into a whirlwind of political intrigue and danger. But nothing had prepared him for what awaited him at Chimneys. The moment he arrived, a sense of foreboding washed over him. The house, with its towering spires and labyrinthine hallways, seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, though it, too, was a player in the mystery that was about to unfold. Chimneys was not just a home, it was a symbol of power, of old bloodlines and royal legacies. Every room, every corridor seemed to whisper of its storied past, and yet, there was a tension in the air that spoke of something much darker, a storm that was about to break. The evening began innocently enough, with guests milling about the grand drawing room, exchanging pleasantries and discussing matters of little consequence. The house was full of intriguing individuals, each one a thread in the tangled web of secrets that had brought them together. Politicians, royalty, and even the house staff all seemed to carry the weight of their own mysteries, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. But the tension that had been simmering just below the surface suddenly erupted with shocking force. The murder of Prince Michael of Czechoslovakia was not just a tragedy, it was an earth-shattering event that would send ripples of suspicion through every corner of Chimneys. The prince, who had arrived at the estate with an air of royal dignity, was found dead in one of the estate's many drawing rooms, his life extinguished under mysterious and brutal circumstances. The news of the murder hit like a thunderclap, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The guests, once so full of laughter and conversation, were now wide-eyed and speechless. The house, which had once seemed so imposing and proud, now seemed to close in around them, a prison of its own design. Who could have done such a thing? The question echoed through the halls of Chimneys as everyone in the house suddenly became a suspect. At the forefront of the investigation was Anthony Cade, who, despite being a stranger to most of the people at Chimneys, was now inexplicably caught up in the drama. He was no detective, but he had a keen mind and a sense of curiosity that could not be ignored. He quickly realized that the murder was no random act of violence. It was a calculated, cold-blooded killing, and every guest at Chimneys seemed to have something to hide. The prince had been a man of considerable influence, and his death was no mere accident. His presence at Chimneys had been part of a larger scheme, a plot to restore Czechoslovakia's monarchy to its former glory. And with his death, the conspirators who had long been working behind the scenes had just lost their most powerful ally. As the investigation began to take shape, the list of suspects grew longer, each one more complex than the last. The first to come under suspicion was Sir Eustace Pedlar, a man with a sharp tongue and a sharp mind, who had always seemed just a little too eager to insert himself into every conversation. His political connections were extensive, and his motives, it seemed, were just as tangled. Had he acted alone, or was he a pawn in a much larger game? Then there was Colonel Race, the stoic and enigmatic officer who had been a fixture of Chimney's guest list. His cold exterior masked a mind that was always calculating, always watching. Was he involved in the plot to restore the monarchy? Or was he simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? And of course, there was Virginia Revel, the woman, whose ties to the European royal family were as mysterious as the house itself. She had seemed so poised, so composed when Anthony first met her, but now, in the wake of the prince's murder, she seemed increasingly uneasy. What role had she played in the prince's death, if any? Was her relationship with him more than just one of a political alliance? But it wasn't just the guests who came under scrutiny. The house staff, too, were not immune to suspicion. The butler, with his cold and professional demeanor, seemed to know more than he let on. The housekeeper, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, was perhaps hiding more than just the secrets of the household. Even the maids, with their whispered conversations and fleeting glances, were now potential players in a far darker game than any of them had anticipated. With every passing hour, the tension in Chimneys grew thicker, and the walls of the estate seemed to close in tighter. Each guest, each member of the staff, each corner of the grand house, became a potential clue. Every word spoken, every gesture made, was analyzed and reanalyzed, as if the very act of living in Chimneys was now an admission of guilt. But despite the growing suspicion, there was something about the house that made it impossible for anyone to leave. The guests were trapped within its walls, the mystery of the prince's death pressing down on them like an invisible weight. And as the hours stretched into days, it became increasingly clear that the murderer was someone among them, hidden in plain sight. The truth, it seemed, was buried beneath layers of lies and half-truths, and as Anthony Cade dug deeper into the mystery, he realized that nothing at Chimneys was as it seemed. There were secrets in every corner, and every face had its own hidden story. Chimneys had become a house of shadows, a place where every whispered conversation, every passing glance, and every hidden doorway might hold the key to unlocking the truth. And as the investigation into the prince's murder continued, Anthony Cade found himself caught in the most dangerous game of all, a game where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. The question, as always, was simple. Who killed Prince Michael of Herzegovina? But the answer, as Anthony would soon discover, was anything but. In the darkened corners of chimneys, secrets were as abundant as the shadows that clung to the towering stone walls. The grand estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, had now become the stage for a deadly game of politics, deception, and ambition. Every guest, every staff member, every room within the mansion held a story that was waiting to be told. And just as the storm outside grew fiercer, so too did the tempest of hidden truths that had been waiting for the right moment to break free. At the heart of the mystery was the plot to restore the monarchy of Herzegovina. It was a political intrigue that stretched its fingers deep into the European power structure, threatening to shake the very foundations of the status quo. Prince Michael's death had been no accident. His death was part of a much larger, more dangerous gamma game, where the stakes were nothing less than the fate of an entire nation. The prince, it seemed, had been one of the key players in a covert effort to re-establish the monarchy in Herzegovina. Behind the walls of chimneys, discussions had taken place, alliances had been forged, and dangerous promises had been made. The prince's memoir, the very one Anthony had been tasked with delivering, contained the key to unlocking the future of a nation. But it was also a dangerous weapon, one that could topple governments, ruin lives, and shift the balance of power across Europe. It wasn't just the murder that hung over chimneys like a storm cloud. It was the realization that, at the heart of it all, there were people willing to kill, to deceive, and to betray in order to ensure the success of their political ambitions. And as Anthony Cade pieced together the clues, he began to understand just how far these conspirators were willing to go. But it was in the midst of this perilous web of politics and power that something unexpected happened, something that could have altered the course of Anthony's own fate. It was in the eyes of Virginia Revel that he found something he hadn't been expecting. Not just an ally, but a woman whose strength and intelligence mirrored his own. Virginia, with her sharp mind and her uncanny ability to navigate the complexities of royal politics, had always been an enigma. She was a woman who carried the weight of her family's legacy on her shoulders, yet she wore that weight with a grace that betrayed no hint of the burden beneath. She was strong-willed, clever, and impossibly composed in the face of danger. But as Anthony got to know her, he realized that beneath that cool exterior was a woman who was just as vulnerable as the rest of them, a woman who had her own secrets, her own fears, and her own past to contend with. It was in the quiet moments between confrontations, the subtle exchanges of glances when no one was watching, that a connection began to form. It wasn't love not yet. Any would. There was something undeniable between them. They were two people caught in the same whirlwind of mystery and murder, and somehow, in the midst of it all, they found solace in one another's presence. But as the mystery of the prince's death deepened, so too did the tension between Anthony and Virginia. She had her own motivations, her own reasons for being involved in the plot to restore the monarchy, and, though she had proven to be an invaluable ally, there were moments when Anthony couldn't help but wonder just how much of her involvement was driven by personal interest, and how much of it was about loyalty to a cause far greater than either of them. As their bond grew stronger, so too did the realization that not everything was as it seemed. Virginia's ties to the European monarchy were deeper and more dangerous than Anthony had ever anticipated. The more he learned about her past, the more questions arose about her true role in the conspiracy. Was she a pawn in a game she couldn't control, or was she a player in her own right, using Anthony just as much as he was using her? But it wasn't just political intrigue and blossoming romance that added to the tension. As Anthony dug deeper into the mystery of the prince's death, he uncovered secrets that were far darker and far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Chimneys, it seemed, was a house of secrets that had been buried for decades, waiting to be unearthed. Hidden passages were discovered behind the grand tapestries, leading to long-forgotten rooms filled with dust and the remnants of a bygone era. These rooms, it seemed, held the answers to some of the greatest mysteries of the estate. One such room, hidden behind a false wall in the library, contained a chest of stolen jewels that had been taken from the royal family of Hercule during a time of turmoil. These jewels, Anthony realized, were not just valuable, they were a symbol of the power struggle that had torn the monarchy apart in the first place. But the discovery of the jewels was only the beginning. The real shock came when Anthony uncovered a decades-old conspiracy, one that stretched back to a time when Chimneys had been the site of another royal scandalone that had been buried by time and forgotten by most. It was a conspiracy that had started with a betrayal, a love affair gone wrong, and a murder that had never been solved. The connections to the prince's death were startling, and it became clear that the threads of the past and present were more tightly woven than anyone could have imagined. Anthony's own role in the mystery grew ever more uncertain. Was he merely a pawn in a game of political maneuvering, or was he becoming something far more dangerous, a man who knew too much and was willing to risk everything to expose the truth? With each new discovery, the walls of Chimneys seemed to close in around him. The murder of Prince Michael was no longer just an isolated crime, it was the opening move in a much larger game, one that involved the highest echelons of power, betrayal, and a legacy that stretched across generations. And as Anthony and Virginia navigated the tangled web of politics, love, and deceit, they realized that the stakes were higher than they could have ever imagined. Chimneys was no longer just a house of secrets, it was a house of revelations, where every hidden passage, every stolen jewel, and every whispered conversation brought them closer to the truth. But in a world where no one was as they seemed, and where even the most trusted allies could turn into enemies in the blink of an eye, Anthony had to ask himself one question: could he trust Virginia? Or had she become just another player in the dangerous game being played behind the walls of Chimneys? The twists were relentless, the stakes were higher than ever, and with every step forward, the shadows of the past grew darker. The evening had descended into a suffocating stillness, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace and the muffled sound of distant thunder. The atmosphere at Chimneys was thick with anticipation, as if the house itself had drawn a breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion of truth. Every face in the room was tight with tension, every eye wary, as if everyone knew that the time had come not just for justice, but for the unraveling of a dark, twisted tale that had been years in the making. Anthony Cade stood at the center of the room, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of a mystery that had consumed him since his arrival. In front of him were the suspects, the men and women who had once seemed like harmless strangers, now revealed as players in a deadly game of ambition and betrayal. The air was thick with suspicion, and every whisper seemed like an accusation. Virginia Revel stood beside him, her face a mask of composure, though Anthony could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had been his ally, his confidant, but even now he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was still hiding, something that could change everything. Was she, too, a part of this tangled web of murder and deceit? He had no answers, only questions that seemed to grow with each passing second. One by one, the remaining guests at Chimneys were gathered together in the grand drawing room. The house had become a prison, its walls now closing in on everyone inside. The sense of isolation was palpable. They were all trapped here, unable to leave until the mystery was solved. And now, with the last pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place, Anthony could feel the tension in the air reach its breaking point. Then, it happened. With a sharp, commanding voice, Anthony addressed the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had once seemed so innocuous, yet were now revealed to be players in a deadly game. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, "the time has come to reveal the truth." A hushed silence fell over the room. Eyes darted nervously from one face to the next. The killer was here, among them. Anthony could feel it in his bones. "The murder of Prince Michael," Anthony continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "was no random act. It was a calculated, cold-blooded assassination, orchestrated by one of you in this very room." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And the motive, power, greed, the restoration of a fallen monarchy, and the secrets that the prince was about to reveal in his memoir." A murmur rippled through the guests. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, while others exchanged nervous glances. Virginia's hand clenched slightly at her side, but she didn't speak. Anthony's eyes locked onto Sir Eustace Pedlar, the self-assured politician who had played the part of the charming, slightly pompous guest with ease. "You, Sir Eustace," Anthony said, his voice firm but laced with an undercurrent of accusation. "You had the most to gain from Prince Michael's death. You had ties to the conspirators who sought to restore the Herzo-Slovakian monarchy. You knew that the prince's memoir contained the proof of your involvement in a plot that would have changed the course of history." Eustace's face turned a shade paler, but he remained composed. He adjusted his tie, his lips twitching in an attempt at a smile. "My dear man, this is outrageous. But before he could finish, Anthony raised a hand to silence him. "It's not over yet," he said, eyes narrowing. "Here is more to this story than just a political assassination." He turned to Colonel Race, the stoic and enigmatic officer whose presence had always been a mystery in itself. "Colonel Race," Anthony said, "you were no stranger to the prince. Your ties to the monarchy were deep, and your involvement in the restoration plot was far from innocent. But your interest in the prince was more personal, wasn't it? You were the one who had arranged for the prince to come to Chimneys, knowing full well what was at stake." Race's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. His eyes, however, were filled with a cold calculation, as if he were weighing his next move. And then there was Virginia, her face now unreadable, but her eyes betraying a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or guilt. Anthony's heart pounded. He had trusted her, believed in her, but could she have been involved after all? He turned to her, his voice trembling slightly, though he refused to show it. "Virginia," he said softly, his eyes locking onto hers, "I never imagined that you—" His voice trailed off, the words caught in his throat. Virginia's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to address her directly. She took a step back, but Anthony could see the tremor in her hand as she reached for her collar. "Anthony," she whispered, her voice laced with vulnerability, "I never meant for it to go this far." And in that moment, the room seemed to collapse into a silence so thick it was almost suffocating. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the truth to unfold, the final twist to reveal itself. Anthony's eyes never left Virginia's. The truth he had uncovered, the pieces of the puzzle he had slowly pieced together, all pointed to one conclusion: the answer was more unexpected more shocking than anyone could have predicted. Anthony took a step forward, his voice low but filled with undeniable certainty. "The truth is," he said, "it was not one of you who murdered Prince Michael." The room erupted in confusion, the suspects exchanging bewildered glances. Anthony smiled, a thin, wry smile. "It was not one of you," he repeated, "because the true murderer wasn't even supposed to be here." A gasp escaped from the gathered crowd. The realization hit them all at once. Chimneys had been a carefully laid trap. The prince's death was only the beginning of a much larger conspiracy, one that had orchestrated the death of a man who had been far too dangerous to live. Anthony Cade turned to reveal the final truth. In a hidden room, buried beneath the foundations of the mansion, there had been one final piece to the puzzle: the memoir itself, and a hidden letter from the prince, outlining the full scale of the conspiracy. And in the letter, there was a name. The name of the murderer. It was Virginia Revel, a woman whose loyalty had been nothing but a carefully crafted illusion. Virginia had been playing both sides, orchestrating the death of Prince Michael to ensure that the conspiracy remained buried. Her connection to the royal family had been the perfect cover-up facade that allowed her to manipulate everyone in the room. But why? Why kill the prince? Because Virginia was no innocent bystander. She had been the one with the most to lose. The restoration of Czechoslovakia's monarchy, the jewels, the secrets Virginia, had been at the heart of the political game all along. She had manipulated everyone, including Anthony, to ensure that the truth remained hidden, that she stayed untouchable. But in the end, she had underestimated Anthony Cade. As the truth finally came to light, the tension in Chimneys shattered like glass. The murderer was unmasked, and with it, the web of lies, power, and betrayal that had ensnared them all. And as Virginia was led away, the final twist struck. The stolen memoir, the jewel-laden conspiracies, and the deadly game of power were no longer secrets. They had been exposed for all to see. But in the cold, silent aftermath, one question lingered in the air. Who else had been part of the conspiracy, and what price would they pay for their involvement? The dust had finally settled over Chimneys, but its stillness was far from peaceful. The echoes of the past, the sharp crackle of truth finally unraveling, lingered in the air like smoke from a long-burned fire. Justice had been served, yes, but the finality of the moment felt like a fragile illusion. The secrets of Chimneys had been exposed, but as anyone who had set foot within its ancient walls could tell you, some mysteries were never truly solved. The grand estate, once a home to laughter and lavish gatherings, now stood silent, its towering stone walls concealing truths that only those who had ventured into its deepest shadows would ever know. The murder of Prince Michael had been but a chapter in a story much larger, a tale of politics, betrayal, and unyielding ambition that had yet to be fully written. Even with the killer unmasked, there was a sense that Chimneys had more to offer, more to reveal, and the sinister allure of its secrets would not be easily forgotten. Anthony Cade stood in the grand hall, his thoughts swirling like the dark clouds that had once surrounded the estate. He had come to Chimneys as an outsider, a simple adventurer with a task, but now he was forever entwined in its legacy. He had solved the mystery, uncovered the killer, and exposed a web of deceit that had stretched across Europe. But there was something else, something that gnawed at him. Behind the completed puzzle, there were still pieces that didn't quite fit. Hidden messages, small clues, and a deeper layer of manipulation had eluded him. Chimneys had been more than just a place for secrets, it had been a stage for something far more sinister, and Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There were whisper-silent, subtle hints that the true mastermind behind the entire conspiracy had never been fully exposed. Anthony felt as though Chimneys was still holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover what had been buried beneath the polished floors and tapestries. Virginia Revel, too, had left her mark on the estate in him. She was the woman who had once been a mystery, and though the veil had lifted to reveal the truth behind her involvement in the prince's murder, Anthony couldn't deny the complex emotions she stirred within him. Her strength, her intelligence, and her vulnerability had all led him to see her as more than just a suspect. There was a connection between them, forged in the heat of danger and betrayal, that couldn't be easily dismissed. Yet, even as they stood together, surrounded by the lingering shadows of the house, there was a certain tension between them, a quiet, unspoken understanding that their story was far from finished. Virginia, now cleared of her role in the murder, seemed a little lighter, a little freer, but Anthony could see the weight in her eyes. She was still not entirely at peace with herself or with the choices she had made. Her past, her family's ties to the conspiracy, had created a gulf between them, a gap that words couldn't bridge. And so, as they stood there, Anthony found himself asking one question, over and over. What now? Could he ever truly trust Virginia? Could she ever trust herself? There was a promise in her eyes when she turned to him, her voice soft yet determined. "Anthony," she said, almost as though she were testing the words before she spoke them aloud. "There is still so much left to be done. We can't leave it like this." And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the beginning of something neither of them could yet fully understand. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the echoes of Chimneys would linger, haunting them both in ways they weren't yet ready to confront. As they walked away from the hall, side by side, the door to Chimneys creaked, almost as if it were about to open again, beckoning them back into its secrets. The estate had been quiet for so long, but as Anthony glanced back, he couldn't shake the feeling that Chimneys wasn't quite finished with them. Justice had been served, but questions remained. The killer was behind bars, but the truth, the real truth, had only just begun to surface. What had driven Virginia to become involved in the conspiracy? Who had been the true puppet master, the one pulling the strings all along? Could Chimneys, with all its hidden rooms and dark corners, hold even greater secrets yet to be discovered? Anthony didn't know, but he had a feeling that Chimneys wasn't done with them yet. As they disappeared into the night, the house stood silent and still, its secrets still wrapped tightly within its stone walls. Would Anthony and Virginia return to uncover them? Or would they walk away, leaving the mystery unsolved, like so many before them had? Chimneys would never stop calling. As we reach the end of this gripping journey through the twisting halls of Chimneys, one thing becomes abundantly clear. Agatha Christie's mastery of storytelling is unparalleled. In The Secret of Chimneys, she seamlessly weaves together a tapestry of mystery, political intrigue, and sharp humor, creating a tale that is both thrilling and surprisingly entertaining. Christie's ability to blend these elements, unveiling the darkest secrets of European royalty, alongside moments of light-hearted wit, makes this novel a masterpiece of suspense. She doesn't just deliver a mystery. She invites readers into a world where every character is a puzzle, every twist is unexpected, and every page leaves you wanting more. This novel is a reminder of why Christie is hailed as the Queen of Mystery. Her brilliance lies not just in the complexity of her plots, but in her ability to engage her audience from start to finish, making us laugh one moment and gasp in disbelief the next. If you've already read The Secret of Chimneys, this is the perfect time to revisit it. If you haven't, then you are in for a thrilling ride-on that will have you second-guessing every character, every plot line, until the very end. Interactive segment. Before we wrap up, let me ask you, who do you think was the murderer? Did you guess correctly, or did Christie's trademark misdirection keep you guessing until the very last page? Share your thoughts in the comments below. It's always fun to see how each reader's instincts lead them down different paths. Fun fact: did you know that Agatha Christie's travels around the world significantly influenced her writing? In The Secret of Chimneys, she expertly blends her knowledge of British aristocracy with her global experiences to craft a rich, complex world that feels both familiar and foreign. Christie's keen observations of culture, politics, and society infuse every aspect of the story, adding layers of depth and authenticity that only a writer of her caliber could achieve. Call to action. If you enjoyed The Secret of Chimneys and its riveting twists, I encourage you to dive into more of Christie's timeless classics. From Murder on the Orient Express to And Then There Were None, her works remain unparalleled in the world of mystery. Explore more of her unforgettable characters, breathtaking suspense, and ingenious plots. Trust me, once you experience Christie's genius, you'll be hooked and you'll never look at a seemingly quiet country estate the same way again. Shadows at Petra. The year is 1938. A warm, golden haze settles over the Holy Land as a luxury tour group arrives, their spirits high, with the promise of discovery and adventure. Ancient ruins, silent witnesses to millennia of history, glimmer under the scorching desert sun. Amidst the chatter and anticipation of the group, one figure stands apart not by choice, but by the oppressive air that surrounds her. Mrs. Boynton, a name that evokes an involuntary shiver among her family members, is no ordinary traveler. Her imposing figure, sharp eyes, and clipped, authoritative tone leave no doubt about her dominion. Every word she speaks is laced with control, every glance calculated to keep her family in line. Those unfortunate enough to share her blood are bound by invisible chains, tethered to a matriarch whose pleasure lies in their misery. Her presence looms like a storm cloud, darkening even the brightest of days. The Boynton family's discomfort is palpable to the other tourists, who exchange uneasy glances but dare not voice their thoughts. Raymond Boynton, Mrs. Boynton's son, carries an air of fragility, his hunched posture and darting eyes speaking of a life lived in fear. Nadine Boynton, the daughter-in-law, offers polite smiles that don't quite reach her eyes, the weight of unspoken sorrow etched into her delicate features. And then here is Ginevra Boynton, the youngest, her distant gaze hinting at a mind retreating into a world of her own, where imaginary friends promise solace her reality cannot. Among the group is Dr. Sarah King, a young doctor whose sharp intellect and compassionate nature contrast sharply with the oppressive dynamics of the Boynton family. Her curiosity is piqued by their strange behavior, her observations revealing more questions than answers. And then here is Hercule Poirot, a man whose name needs no introduction. Though traveling for leisure, his sharp, observant eyes miss nothing. He, too, senses the tension radiating from the Boyntons, a tension that seems to thrum louder with every passing hour. It is against this backdrop that the unthinkable happens. During an excursion to an isolated archaeological site, the oppressive shadow of Mrs. Boynton is lifted, but not in a way anyone expected. Her lifeless body is discovered slumped against a weathered rock, the ancient ruins around her now a silent stage for a fresh tragedy. The local police, accustomed to the harsh realities of desert travel, quickly conclude that her death was natural, perhaps the result of overexertion in the relentless heat. But Poirot's instincts tell him otherwise. Whispers of suppressed anger, fearful glances exchanged among the Boyntons, and the subtle clues left in their wake paint a picture far more sinister. Poirot's curiosity is piqued, and with it, the wheels of his unmatched mind begin to turn. What was it about Mrs. Boynton that held her family in such a vice-like grip? And what secrets could have led to her untimely death? The desert's secrets will soon be unearthed, but not all who dig into the shadows will emerge unscathed. A tyrant's grip. Poirot immerses himself in the Boynton family's tragic narrative, uncovering Mrs. Boynton's reign of psychological terror. Every aspect of their lives was meticulously controlled. Meals, interactions, even their thoughts seemed bound by her rules. Her presence loomed large over the household, a shadow too daunting to escape. Witnesses recount how she would dangle hope like a cruel jest offering the prospect of release, only to snatch it away. Poirot pieces together stories of unfulfilled dreams, crushed ambitions, and stolen joys. She orchestrated conflicts among the family, ensuring their reliance on her. The question grows clearer in his mind. Who had finally found the courage to resist her tyranny? Raymond's fleeting escape plans. Poirot's conversations with Raymond reveal a young man on the edge of breaking free. His plans for escape were fragile, yet earnest small sums of money saved from allowances, carefully plotted routes to a new life. But his fear of reprisal kept him rooted. Poirot observes the conflicting emotions in Raymond's eyes. The yearning for freedom, tinged with guilt over abandoning his siblings. One slip of the tongue hints at a heated argument with Mrs. Boynton before her death. Was his resolve to escape strong enough to push him toward murder, or was someone else aware of his plans? Nadine's diary of frustrations. Nadine's diary becomes a treasure trove of insight for Poirot. Her words lay bare the emotional scars inflicted by years under Mrs. Boynton's thumb. She writes about her growing resentment, her longing for a life outside the suffocating walls of the family. Poirot finds a particularly poignant entry. If only she would vanish, we could all breathe again. The diary reveals her struggles to maintain loyalty to her husband, Jefferson, while yearning for independence. Poirot is struck by the rawness of her entries. Did her desperation lead to action? Or was she another victim in this tangled web? Ginevra's imaginary conversations. Poirot's keen eye focuses on Ginevra, whose fragile mental state becomes a key thread in the investigation. Her whispered dialogues with imaginary figures hint at deep psychological trauma. She talks of justice and vengeance, weaving fantastical narratives where she is both victim and savior. Poirot cannot dismiss her as merely delusional. Her words carry veiled truths. Could her subconscious have driven her to an act of violence, or is she merely echoing the collective anger of the family? A mysterious letter. Poirot's discovery of the torn letter adds a tantalizing layer to the mystery. The fragment reads, "Tonight it ends." The handwriting is jagged, as if written in haste or anger. Poirot theorizes that the letter was intended for Mrs. Boynton but never delivered. Who wrote it, and what did they hope to accomplish that night? The unanswered questions gnaw at him, pushing him closer to the truth. Unlikely allies. Dr. Sarah King emerges as an essential ally in Poirot's investigation. Her observations of the family dynamics, the furtive glances, the tension-filled silence offer Poirot valuable leads. Her medical background allows her to detect signs of stress and fear among the Boyntons, details that Poirot uses to build his case. Yet, Sarah's involvement isn't without scrutiny. Poirot wonders, is she merely an observer, or does she have her own reasons for wanting justice? A web of lies. The deeper Poirot delves, the more convoluted the story becomes. Each family member's account of the fateful night contradicts the others, forming a labyrinth of deceit. Poirot's methodical mind begins untangling these lies, noting the inconsistencies and identifying the truths hidden within. Every revelation tightens the noose around the culprit, but it also lays bare the years of pain and oppression that have scarred the family. The secrets unearthed paint a grim picture of a household broken by tyranny and driven to desperation. With each clue, Poirot inches closer to unveiling the truth. Yet, he is acutely aware of the stakes. The sands of the desert hold their secrets tightly, but Poirot's determination is unwavering. The path to justice, he knows, is never straightforward. A lethal injection. The revelation of poison in Mrs. Boynton's system shatters the initial assumption of a natural death. The local authorities, hesitant to confront the possibility of murder, reluctantly reopen the case. Poirot, however, seizes the moment with characteristic precision. The poison, a rare and exotic substance derived from desert plants, speaks of careful planning. It was not something easily obtained or administered without knowledge. Poirot's meticulous questioning of the family and staff reveals an unsettling detail. Someone had access to Mrs. Boynton's medical supplies. A trained eye would be required to inject the poison subtly, without raising suspicion. Poirot's focus sharpens on the moments leading up to Mrs. Boynton's death. Who had approached her that day? Who had the opportunity and, more importantly, the knowledge to carry out such an act? The murder, he reasons, is not one of passion, but of calculated intent. It is a chilling prospect. Someone had resolved to end Mrs. Boynton's reign with methodical precision, ensuring no loose ends would point back to them. An unexpected witness. Poirot's investigation takes an unexpected turn when a Bedouin guide, previously thought to be an inconsequential observer, steps forward. The guide describes seeing a shadowy figure near Mrs. Boynton's tent the night of her death. The figure, cloaked in darkness, moved with deliberate care, avoiding the faint glow of the lanterns. Poirot listens intently, his mind racing with possibilities. The description is vague and no distinct features, no incriminating details, but the timing aligns too perfectly to be dismissed. Poirot questions the guide further, probing for any small detail that might break the case wide open. The guide hesitates, then reveals something astonishing. The figure paused briefly, seemingly to listen for movement within the camp, before disappearing into the night. Poirot's sharp mind connects this behavior with the calculated nature of the crime. The killer had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Red herrings. As Poirot digs deeper, he uncovers a stranger's journal among the camp's belongings. The journal, bound in worn leather, contains cryptic entries about Mrs. Boynton's past. The writer's tone shifts between admiration and hatred, painting a complex portrait of someone obsessed with her. Poirot's curiosity is piqued. Who was this stranger, and what was their connection to Mrs. Boynton? The entries suggest a vendetta rooted in events long before the Boynton family's journey to the Holy Land. One passage in particular stands out. "She will pay for what she did. The world must see her true face." Poirot considers the possibility of an external threat, a shadow from Mrs. Boynton's past returning to haunt her. But as he examines the journal more closely, he detects inconsistencies. The handwriting does not match any samples taken from the Boynton family or staff. Was this a deliberate plant to mislead the investigation? Poirot's instincts tell him to tread carefully. The journal may be a red herring, designed to divert attention from the true culprit. A tapestry of motives, the discovery of poison, a mysterious figure, and the journal forces Poirot to reevaluate his theories. He begins to see the crime as a tapestry woven with multiple threads, each suspect's motives intertwined with another's. Mrs. Boynton's death, he realizes, is not just the culmination of years of familial strife, but also a flashpoint for long-buried secrets. Poirot's sharp intellect discerns patterns others might overlook. The Boynton family's collective anguish, the Bedouin guide's observation, and the journal's cryptic threats, all these elements are pieces of a larger puzzle. The investigation takes Poirot deep into the family psyche. He revisits their accounts of the night, comparing their words against the growing body of evidence. The contradictions become glaring. Raymond's nervous demeanor, Nadine's veiled anger, Ginevra's cryptic remarks, and even Sarah King's measured observations each carries a kernel of truth wrapped in layers of deceit. Poirot knows the key lies not just in what they say, but in what they avoid saying, the shadow of conspiracy. Poirot begins to suspect a larger conspiracy at play. Mrs. Boynton's control extended beyond her immediate family. Her connections and influence touched lives far removed from the camp. Poirot's inquiries uncover whispers of financial dealings, debts unpaid, and alliances forged in secrecy. Was the poison meant only for Mrs. Boynton, or was it a message to others who defied the same shadowy forces? Poirot's relentless pursuit of the truth brings him face to face with the fragility of human nature. The poison that ended Mrs. Boynton's life symbolizes not just death, but also the toxic influence she wielded. As the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, Poirot prepares to unveil the truth, knowing that the shadows of the past may yet cast their final, damning light on the present. With the stage set and the suspect's motives laid bare, Poirot inches closer to a revelation that will shake the Boynton family to its core. The poison's legacy, he realizes, is not just the death of a tyrant, but the unmasking of secrets that may forever change the lives of those she left behind. Climax. Shadows in the ruins. The wind whispered through the narrow canyons of Petra, carrying with it a haunting chill that settled deep within the bones of the gathered group. The ancient sandstone structures, bathed in the fading light of the desert sun, loomed like silent sentinels. They had walked through this historic labyrinth before, but tonight, the ruins felt charged with a darker energy. The group had been led to the grand weathered temple, its columns reaching toward the sky, cracked and worn from centuries of erosion. Here, Poirot had chosen to confront them alone last time. The tension was palpable, as each member of the tour group stood, somewhat uneasily, in the shadow of the grand facade. Mrs. Boynton's death had shaken them, but there was an unnerving realization creeping upon them, that all of them might be somehow involved. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the faces before him, each mask of uncertainty and feigned innocence telling its own story. "Tonight we shall speak the truth," Poirot said softly, his voice a low command, as if the words themselves were imbued with the weight of centuries. The detective's gaze turned first to Dr. Sarah King. Her calm demeanor was at odds with the clenched fists hidden beneath her pristine jacket sleeves. "Dr. King," Poirot began, "you were closest to the victim in the hours leading to her death. Tell me, was it your concern for her health that brought you to her side, or something else? Perhaps a hidden alliance?" The air seemed to thicken with the question. Dr. King's face remained composed, but the faintest flicker of something, guilt, regret, or even fear, passed through her eyes. She shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her secrets pressing against her chest. Poirot wasn't finished. He could see it, the cracks in her facade, and he pressed on. "Tell me of your relationship with Mrs. Boynton," Poirot continued. "The history that binds you?" Sarah's lips parted slightly, her breath shallow, and for a moment it seemed as if she might collapse under the pressure, but then her eyes hardened. "I was her personal physician, Monsieur Poirot, nothing more." But Poirot, the master of observation, wasn't buying it. "Ah, but the truth. It is rarely so simple, n'est-ce pas?" His words rang out in the vast temple, echoing off the stone walls. "You see, there are whispers of a more personal connection. A debt, perhaps, or a more emotional involvement." A deep silence followed. The others shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. Mrs. Boynton's oppressive shadow seemed to hang over them all, and Poirot's relentless pursuit of the truth was digging at something they all hoped would remain buried. Poirot turned his attention now to the youngest of the group, Michael, the quiet, brooding man who seemed to avoid eye contact. His disheveled appearance, a telltale sign of inner turmoil, caught Poirot's attention. "You?" Poirot said, his voice a little softer, though no less commanding. "Have you been hiding something, Michael? Something beyond the obvious grief you claim to feel for the death of your stepmother?" Michael flinched, his eyes darting nervously. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. Poirot stepped closer, his shoes tapping softly against the ancient stones. "Oh, but you do. Your debts, your secrets. It is not just your stepmother's passing that has shaken you. It is what she held over you. The ties that bound you together in a financial prison, one that only her death could release you from." Michael's face turned pale, and the facade crumbled. His eyes locked onto Poirot's, filled with a raw desperation. I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I wanted her to change her will, but not like this." The truth spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and the others in the group gasped as the weight of his confession filled the air. Michael had been trying to force his stepmother's hand, to change the inheritance in his favor. His quiet rage had been building for years, hidden beneath layers of politeness. But it was not him who had struck the fatal blow. He had only planned it, and his co-conspirator had been closer than anyone realized. Poirot turned to the final key figure in the room, the elusive Mrs. Boynton's son, who had appeared detached from the emotional chaos surrounding the death. His eyes flickered nervously as Poirot turned his steady gaze toward him. "And you," Poirot said, his voice like the strike of a clock's chime. "You were not as innocent as you pretended to be, were you? You knew of the plan, you helped orchestrate it." The son's jaw tightened, and he took a step back, as if trying to distance himself from the scrutiny. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered, barely audible, his words revealing his complicity. "She was unbearable. We all wanted her gone, but no one could bring themselves to do it." Poirot's expression remained unchanged, his mind piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. Mrs. Boynton had been a tyrant, manipulating her family for years. Her death was the result of years of anger, deceit, and desperation, but in the end, it was not a single hand that ended her life. It was the combined forces of a family long broken by resentment, buried secrets, and betrayal. With the last piece of the puzzle in place, Poirot stood silently for a moment, his piercing gaze sweeping over the group. The wind outside howled through the ruins, as if urging him to finish what he had started. "You?" Poirot said, his voice a little softer, though no less commanding. "Have you been hiding something, Michael? Something beyond the obvious grief you claim to feel for the death of your stepmother?" Michael flinched, his eyes darting nervously. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. Poirot stepped closer, his shoes tapping softly against the ancient stones. "Oh, but you do. Your debts, your secrets. It is not just your stepmother's passing that has shaken you. It is what she held over you. The ties that bound you together in a financial prison, one that only her death could release you from." Michael's face turned pale, and the facade crumbled. His eyes locked onto Poirot's, filled with a raw desperation. I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I wanted her to change her will, but not like this." The truth spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and the others in the group gasped as the weight of his confession filled the air. Michael had been trying to force his stepmother's hand, to change the inheritance in his favor. His quiet rage had been building for years, hidden beneath layers of politeness. But it was not him who had struck the fatal blow. He had only planned it, and his co-conspirator had been closer than anyone realized. Poirot turned to the final key figure in the room, the elusive Mrs. Boynton's son, who had appeared detached from the emotional chaos surrounding the death. His eyes flickered nervously as Poirot turned his steady gaze toward him. "And you," Poirot said, his voice like the strike of a clock's chime. "You were not as innocent as you pretended to be, were you? You knew of the plan. You helped orchestrate it." The son's jaw tightened, and he took a step back, as if trying to distance himself from the scrutiny. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered, barely audible, his words revealing his complicity. "She was unbearable. We all wanted her gone, but no one could bring themselves to do it." Poirot's expression remained unchanged, his mind piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. Mrs. Boynton had been a tyrant, manipulating her family for years. Her death was the result of years of anger, deceit, and desperation, but in the end, it was not a single hand that ended her life. It was the combined forces of a family long broken by resentment, buried secrets, and betrayal. With the last piece of the puzzle in place, Poirot stood silently for a moment, his piercing gaze sweeping over the group. The wind outside howled through the ruins, as if urging him to finish what he had started. A murmur rippled through the group. Mrs. Boynton's son, his face pale, took an instinctive step back, his hand brushing against the worn stone wall behind him. Dr. King's eyes darted around the room, looking for any escape, her fingers twitching in her coat pockets. Michael, his earlier confession still fresh in the air, swallowed hard, but his eyes were wild, frantic. Poirot held up a hand, signaling for silence. The world around them seemed to stop, the echoes of time falling away, as the detective stood at the center of it all, a man who knew, at last, who had committed the crime. "You see, the murder of Mrs. Boynton," Poirot said, "was not simply a matter of inheritance. No, it was something far deeper. A desire not just for freedom, but for vengeance, for liberation from the years of control, of manipulation. The victim's death was not the result of a single moment of rage. It was the culmination of years of slow-burning hatred." The words hung in the air like smoke, curling around the group's collective consciousness. Poirot's eyes, sharp as daggers, landed on the unassuming woman standing just behind the others, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. It was Mrs. Boynton's daughter, the soft-spoken, seemingly innocent woman who had hardly spoken a word since the beginning of their journey. "You," Poirot said, his voice now filled with a chilling certainty. "You are the one who killed your mother." A stunned silence fell over the group. It was as if time itself had stopped. The woman, Catherine, stood frozen, her face ashen. Her lips parted, but no words came. A tremor ran through her, but she did not break down, did not fall to her knees as they had expected. Instead, her eyes, those pale, tired eyes, met Poirot's with an eerie calm. "You," she whispered, almost as if the words were foreign to her. "You knew." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he observed her reaction. "Ah, madame, I knew from the start it was always you. Your motive was the most pure, the most complex, love and hate, both entwined. You were the one who could not forgive your mother for what she did to you, for what she did to your family." Catherine took a deep breath, her face tightening. She ruined us," she murmured, as if speaking to herself, her voice a mixture of pain and resolve. "She took everything. Our futures, our identities, our happiness, all in the name of control, all for her twisted version of what family should be. She destroyed us." Poirot took a step toward her, his voice steady but cutting. "You were the one who saw through her lies. You knew that she had to be stopped. And when her death came, It was not only a release, it was revenge for all the years of suffering. The inheritance? A secondary matter. What you truly wanted was her control over you gone forever. Catherine's lips curled into a grim smile, though her eyes were filled with a mix of sorrow and something darker, satisfaction. You're right, it was never just about the money. It was about freedom, freedom from the woman who had held us all captive. I planned it. I waited. I made sure she was alone that night when the poison could do its work without interference. Her hands, trembling slightly now, moved to her side. Slowly, she pulled a small vial from her coat pocket, dark, glass, and deadly. You poisoned her, Poirot continued, his voice quiet but fierce. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you made sure it looked like a natural death, a heart attack. It was clever, very clever. No one would have suspected you, the quiet daughter, the meek one, the one who suffered silently. But the truth is, this was the only way to set yourself free. Catherine's expression shifted, a brief flicker of regret passing through her. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. She straightened, her resolve hardening once more. She made me do it. I didn't have a choice. She would have never let me live my life. She was poison, and I had to stop her. Poirot nodded solemnly, but his eyes never left her. You have been freed, madame, but not without cost. The blood you sought to spill has stained your hands. The group, still in shock, looked at Catherine with a mixture of disbelief and pity. Some whispered under their breath. Others stood frozen, too stunned to react. Catherine glanced at each of them, the weight of the moment sinking in. I've lived with this my whole life, she said, her voice hollow. And now I will face the consequences. As she was led away by the authorities, Poirot remained standing, watching the figures move through the ancient ruins. The desert winds whispered in the distance, carrying the secrets of a family shattered by betrayal and vengeance. The killer had been unmasked, not the one they expected, but the one who had carried the darkest secrets of all. And in the shadows of Petra, the truth had finally come to light. The morning after the storm of revelations, the ruins of Petra stood silent beneath a sky washed clean by the night's winds. The ancient stones, witnesses to centuries of human history, now seemed to absorb the weight of an entirely different kind of truth. The truth of a family freed from the suffocating grasp of a tyrant. The group, disbanded and scattered, began the long, painful process of rebuilding their lives. Mrs. Boynton's death had been the catalyst, the final violent upheaval that shattered the brittle facade of their existence. But now, in the aftermath, something new began to stir in the remains of the wreckage. Catherine, the woman who had orchestrated her mother's demise, stood alone at the edge of the camp, looking out over the desert landscape. Her eyes, once clouded with bitterness, now seemed to hold the faintest glimmer of something else. Perhaps hope, perhaps redemption. The hard lines of her face had softened, and there was a tentative calm about her as she took in the view. Behind her, her brother Michael approached, his expression a mixture of relief and confusion. His once haggard face had lost some of its weariness, but the scars of years spent in the shadow of their mother's cruelty still lingered in his eyes. They exchanged a look, heavy with unspoken words. "Do you think we'll ever be free of her?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine didn't turn to him right away. She stood still, her fingers running lightly over the rim of the stone she leaned against. "No," she said finally, her voice softer than he expected. "But we have a chance now, a chance to rebuild, to be who we were always meant to be." Michael nodded, though his gaze remained distant, as if uncertain of the path ahead. "It's hard to know where to begin." Catherine smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Michael had seen in years. "Maybe we start with forgiveness for ourselves." She paused, considering her own words. "We can't change the past, Michael, but we can decide what we do with the future." In the distance, Dr. Sarah King walked alone, her shoulders straight, her expression guarded, but not as tightly wound as before. She had spoken little since the night of the confession, but now, as she glanced over her shoulder at the ruins, a sense of resolution seemed to settle in her. She had known for years the toll that Mrs. Boynton's manipulation had taken on this family, and while she had never condoned the act of murder, there was something undeniably freeing in the air. The power of control that had once crushed their spirits was gone, and in its place, a strange kind of liberation lingered. The others, too, began to stir. The oppressive atmosphere that had gripped them for so long seemed to evaporate as each person took tentative steps into their own new lives. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping moments of catharsis, but in every gesture, every quiet movement, they could feel the weight of a heavy chain lifting from their shoulders. The boy's heirloom ring, once a symbol of captivity, was now tossed aside, forgotten in the dust of the past. Poirot, watching from the edge of the camp, stood in quiet reflection. His job was done. The murder had been solved, the guilty punished, and justice, however imperfect, had been served. But even in the triumph of revealing the killer, there was a lingering sadness in his heart. He had witnessed too many lives touched by suffering, too many people torn apart by greed, vengeance, and fear. The group, once so fractured, was now united in their shared grief and the weight of their newfound freedom. Yet Poirot knew well that this was not the end of their journey, but rather the beginning of something much harder, the rebuilding of a family that had been shattered not just by a murder, but by years of emotional imprisonment. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting its warm glow over the desert landscape, Poirot turned away. His heart ached, but it was not for the family alone. It was for the complexities of human nature, the emotions that lay hidden beneath the surface, the decisions made in the heat of passion, and the ultimate price that had to be paid for freedom. Poirot's reflection. Poirot made his way to the small, solitary cabin that had been set up for him, his mind full of the same thoughts that had consumed him since the moment he first set foot in this place. He could not forget the faces of those he had uncovered, the brokenness that had shaped them all, nor the fine thread of cruelty and love that had bound them together. The detective paused at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. There was a certain serenity in the air now, a peace that had been absent for so long, and yet something gnawed at him, a disquiet that refused to be silenced. He knew that the darkness of human emotion was not so easily defeated. It lingered, always, beneath the surface, ready to return in another form, in another moment of weakness. Poirot entered the cabin, sitting by the small desk in the corner. He poured himself a drink, a small comfort after the storm he had weathered, and took a moment to reflect. He thought of Catherine, standing on the edge of freedom, her hands stained with her own brand of vengeance, but also with the promise of a new beginning. He thought of Michael, who had been forced to live in the shadows of his own guilt and confusion, now left to find his own way in a world that had changed irrevocably. He thought of Sarah, whose quiet strength had never wavered, and who, like the others, now had to live with the ghosts of the past and the complexities of her own choices. Poirot's gaze drifted to the window, where the wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the distant cries of the desert birds. It was a sound both haunting and beautiful, as though the land itself had witnessed too much, yet continued to endure. In the stillness, Poirot found his thoughts circling back to the heart of the matter, the deep complexities of human nature that had driven each of these people to their breaking point. He had seen them all in their darkest moments. And yet, in the end, they were human. All too human. And that, Poirot thought, was both their greatest strength and their deepest flaw. Justice, in the end, was not so much about punishment as it was about understanding. Understanding the forces that shaped these individuals, the pain and love that had twisted their lives into something unrecognizable. And it was in that understanding, that recognition of the delicate balance between right and wrong, that Poirot had found his peace. As he sat there, the world outside his window slowly awakening to a new day, Poirot knew that his work here was done. But he also knew that the real journey had just begun. For them and for himself. The mysteries of the human heart, with all its contradictions, would continue to unfold, and he, Hercule Poirot, would be there to observe, to understand, and, when necessary, to seek justice. With that thought, Poirot rose, his mind already turning to the next case. There was always another mystery to solve, another heart to understand, and the world, in all its chaos and complexity, would keep spinning on, forever. Lingering mystery. As Poirot's train began to chug slowly away from the desert station, the quiet rhythm of its wheels clicking over the tracks seemed to match the steady beat of his thoughts. The towering mountains of Petra were just visible in the distance, their jagged peaks now softened by the early morning light. He had solved the case, yes, but there was a restlessness in his chest, a nagging feeling that wouldn't let go. It wasn't just the case that haunted him. It was the lingering shadows of Mrs. Boynton's past, the secrets that had been buried so deep they had never seen the light of day. As the train pulled out from the station, Poirot leaned back in his seat, his sharp eyes scanning the passing landscape. He had not expected the conclusion of this investigation to weigh on him as it did. It was a case of liberation, of family torn asunder, of vengeance enacted and justice delivered. And yet there was something about Mrs. Boynton's death that didn't sit quite right, something that didn't add up. He was lost in these thoughts when the train's motion came to a halt with a sudden jolting force. The sound of brakes screeching against metal echoed in the otherwise silent air. Poirot, startled but not alarmed, looked out the window just in time to see a solitary figure approaching the train. A Bedouin man, dressed in the flowing, earth-toned robes of his people, was striding purposefully toward the platform. It was the guide who had accompanied them on their journey through the desert, the man who had led them to Petra. The same man who had remained an enigma, silent and stoic, his eyes ever watchful, his presence always just a little too observant for comfort. Poirot's brow furrowed. He had not seen the man since the investigation had concluded. Yet here he was, standing now just outside the train door, waiting for the detective. The desert wind tousled the man's long, dark hair, and his expression was one of quiet intensity. Poirot, ever polite but always cautious, raised an eyebrow as the man approached. "Monsieur," he greeted, his voice smooth, yet tinged with curiosity. "It is a surprise to see you here." The guide smiled, but there was a coldness in his eyes, a knowing, almost ominous gleam. He glanced over his shoulder, as though ensuring no one else was within earshot, then turned back to Poirot. "It is not the end of the story, you see," the guide said in a low, gravelly voice, his accent thick but clear. "Not the end for you or for her." Poirot's interest piqued immediately, his fingers tightening around the edge of his seat. "What do you mean, monsieur?" His voice remained steady, but inside, his instincts were alert, on edge. There was something in the guide's tone that sent a ripple of unease through him. The guide hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if deciding how much to reveal. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he reached into the folds of his robes and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. no larger than a handkerchief, but its contents seemed to burn with significance. This, the guide said, pressing the envelope into Poirot's hand, was found among the belongings of Mrs. Boynton, a personal letter, one that no one else knew about. She had it hidden, you see, for years. It tells a different story of who she was. Poirot studied the envelope carefully, noting the faint seal pressed onto the paper. It wasn't anything he recognized, but the mere fact that it had been concealed for so long added layers of mystery to the case. He turned his gaze back to the guide, his eyes narrowing. "Why have you given this to me, monsieur? What is it you are telling me?" The guide looked at him with a slow, knowing smile. "The truth, it seems, is not always what we believe. Mrs. Boynton was not the only one with secrets. Her past, it is tangled with something far deeper, something tied to the land itself." Poirot's grip on the envelope tightened, his pulse quickening ever so slightly. "What do you mean?" The guide's voice lowered even further, barely a whisper now, but it carried the weight of unspoken truths. "There are whispers among my people, whispers of a family long lost to the sands, of a woman who made enemies in places you cannot imagine. Mrs. Boynton was more than just a cruel matriarch, Monsieur Poirot. She was connected to something darker. And now, with her gone, those who seek her secrets will come for what's left." A chill ran down Poirot's spine, though his face remained unreadable. The guide's words felt like a stone being dropped into the quiet, stagnant waters of his mind, sending ripples that threatened to unsettle everything. Mrs. Boynton's death had not been an isolated event. It was part of something much larger, a web of conspiracy that stretched far beyond the confines of the family and the immediate murder. The guide turned to leave, his cloak billowing behind him as he moved toward the station platform. "Be careful, Monsieur Poirot," he called over his shoulder, his voice distant yet loaded with forewarning. "Not all stories are told with truth. Some are buried in the dust, but dust, it has a way of returning." Poirot stood frozen in his seat, the envelope still clutched in his hand, the weight of it suddenly heavy with implications he couldn't yet fathom. His mind, ever sharp, churned through the possibilities. What had Mrs. Boynton been involved in? What had she hidden so carefully? And why had it been so dangerous? And more importantly, who else was involved in the dangerous game that had played out under the veil of a family tragedy? And, with a final glance at the retreating figure of the guide, Poirot's gaze turned to the envelope once more. As the train slowly began to move forward, carrying him away from the land that had borne witness to so much tragedy and intrigue, Poirot knew one thing for certain. This was not the end. There was a mystery still to be uncovered, a deeper conspiracy that remained hidden in the shifting sands. And Poirot, ever the seeker of truth, knew that the echoes of this case would follow him for a long time to come. As the desert stretched out before him, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, Poirot's mind raced. There was no doubt about it. He would return. The story was far from finished. The spark of intrigue. London, 1930s. The heartbeat of a thrilling mystery. The newsroom buzzed like a beehive. A cacophony of clacking typewriter keys and shouted exchanges echoing off the high ceilings. Men in crisp shirts with rolled-up sleeves leaned over desks cluttered with papers, while women darted about with steaming cups of tea and stacks of fresh print. The air smelled of ink, smoke, and ambition. For Eleanor Ellie Harper, it was her natural habitat. Ellie's desk was tucked near the far wall, just close enough to the editor's office to catch the faint whiff of cigar smoke and the occasional raised voice of Mr. Hamish Carter, the editor-in-chief. Her leather-bound notepad, filled with shorthand scrawls, sat open before her, A fountain pen twirled idly between her fingers as she observed the controlled chaos around her. For Ellie, journalism wasn't just a job, it was her calling, her lifeline to a world that often seemed too tangled in shadows. Today, however, something felt off. The usual hum of activity carried a strange undercurrent of tension, as if the entire newsroom were holding its collective breath. Conversations were quieter, and glances exchanged between reporters seemed more furtive than usual. Ellie had learned to trust her instincts, and they were screaming at her now. It wasn't until the phone at the far corner of the room rang that the energy shifted. Heads turned as the call was answered by Tommy Whitaker, the paper's star investigative reporter. Tommy, a sharp-eyed man with a perpetually rumpled suit, was known for sniffing out stories that could topple politicians and ruin fortunes. Ellie's eyes narrowed as she watched him listen intently, his expression darkening with every passing second. Tommy's voice dropped to a near whisper, but in the otherwise subdued atmosphere, Ellie caught snippets of his end of the conversation. Branwell Estate, death, unusual circumstances. Her pen stilled in her hand. The Branwell Estate, that name carried weight, whispered in the circles of London's elite. The Branwells were old money, steeped in tradition and scandal. Something significant had happened. Tommy's call ended abruptly, and without a word to anyone, he grabbed his coat and hat, muttering something unintelligible as he strode out the door. Ellie's curiosity sparked into a flame. Whispers in the newsroom. Ellie rose from her desk, her notepad tucked under her arm, and approached the editor's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear Mr. Carter's voice raised in what sounded like a heated argument. "I don't care if it's the bloody Branwells," he barked. "If T here is a story there, we're covering it. But tell Tommy to tread carefully. The last thing we need is a lawsuit." She hesitated, debating whether to eavesdrop further or knock. Before she could decide, the door swung open, and Mr. Carter's sharp gaze landed on her. "Harper," he snapped, "what are you loitering for? Got nothing better to do?" Ellie's mind raced. "Just wanted to confirm my assignment for tomorrow," she lied smoothly. "Your assignment is to stay out of Tommy's way," Carter growled, lighting a fresh cigar. "That's all you need to know for now." With that, he slammed the door shut, leaving Ellie standing in the hallway with more questions than answers. Something big was unfolding, and the fact that Carter was being tight-lipped only heightened her suspicion. A vanishing act. The next morning, the newsroom's tension had thickened into a palpable weight. Tommy had not returned, and whispers swirled among the staff. Ellie overheard snippets of conversation. Didn't check in. No word since last night, and most chillingly, Branwell Estate. By midday, Carter emerged from his office, his face a mask of barely concealed frustration. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Ellie. "Harper," he barked, "you are covering for Whitaker. Get out to the Branwell Estate and bring me something printable, and keep it straightforward. No embellishments, no digging." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She nodded, already grabbing her coat and camera. "Don't make me regret this," Carter added as she passed him. The journey to the estate. The Branwell Estate lay on the outskirts of London, nestled in a picturesque but remote part of the countryside. The journey there felt like stepping back in time. As the city's bustling streets gave way to winding lanes bordered by towering trees, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving behind more than just the modern conveniences of the city. She was venturing into the unknown. The estate itself was an imposing sight. A grand, sprawling manor with ivy creeping up its stone walls, it exuded an air of faded opulence. The gates creaked as they opened, and Ellie's cab rolled up the long gravel drive. As she stepped out, the chill in the air seemed to bite deeper than it should, and the silence was almost unnerving. A butler greeted her at the door, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Harper, I presume," he intoned. Ellie nodded, clutching her notepad and camera tightly. "I am here to inquire about the incident," she said, keeping her tone professional. "Of course," the butler replied. "Please wait in the drawing room. The family will see you shortly." As she entered the house, Ellie couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The grand halls, adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, seemed to loom over her. Shadows danced along the walls, and every creak of the floorboards set her nerves on edge. A family of secrets. The Branwells were everything Ellie had imagined and more. George Branwell, the patriarch, had the air of a man used to control but was visibly fraying at the edges. His wife, Margaret, was the picture of stoic elegance, though her tight-lipped demeanor hinted at a fierceness beneath the surface. Julia, their rebellious daughter, exuded defiance, her sharp gaze daring anyone to challenge her. And then there was Henry, the youngest son, who seemed to hover in the background, his gaunt features and restless movements speaking of inner turmoil. Ellie introduced herself, her sharp journalist's eye taking in every detail of the room and its occupants. The family's version of events was rehearsed and overly polished. George spoke of an unfortunate accident, his tone clipped and unyielding. Margaret chimed in occasionally, her words carefully chosen. Julia remained silent, her eyes fixed on the window, while Henry fidgeted, avoiding Ellie's gaze. "And where was Mr. Whittaker, the reporter sent here last night?" Ellie asked, her tone casual. The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. George's jaw tightened, and Margaret's hand gripped the arm of her chair. Julia finally turned her gaze to Ellie, her lips curving into a faint, enigmatic smile. "He left," George said firmly. "As far as I know, he's not here." Ellie's instincts screamed that he was lying. And if Tommy had left, where had he gone? Why hadn't he returned to the newsroom? The first clue. As the family dispersed, Ellie took the opportunity to explore the house. Armed with her camera and notebook, she wandered through the grand halls, her journalist's eyes scanning for anything out of place. It was in the library that she found her first clue, a faint burn mark on the edge of a rug, as if something had been hastily destroyed. Nearby, an ashtray held the remnants of what looked like charred paper. Ellie's heart raced as she photographed the evidence. Whatever secrets the Branwells were hiding, she was determined to uncover them. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a puzzle, and Ellie Harper was ready to solve it no matter the cost. Rising action, layers of deception. The train ride to the Branwell estate was uneventful, save for Ellie's restless thoughts. She replayed the details of the newsroom call in her head, feeling the weight of the assignment. On the surface, it was just another report about a tragic accident, but her gut told her there was more to it. As the sprawling countryside gave way to the imposing silhouette of the Branwell mansion, a sense of unease crept over her. The estate was an architectural marvel, its Gothic arches and towering spires casting long shadows under the waning sunlight. Ellie noted the faint smell of damp wood and old stone as she approached the massive oak doors. A butler, tall and stoic, greeted her with a curt nod and ushered her inside. The investigation begins. Ellie's first impression of the Branwell family was far from warm. George Branwell, the patriarch, exuded a stern and unapproachable air. His sharp suit was impeccably tailored, but his eyes betrayed weariness, perhaps from years of managing the family's declining fortune. Margaret, his wife, was equally intimidating. Her posture was regal, her every word carefully chosen to maintain an image of propriety. Yet there was a tension in her voice, a crack in the armor that suggested she was hiding something. Julia, the eldest daughter, was a stark contrast to her parents. With her bold fashion choices and defiant attitude, she seemed out of place in the somber household. Her sharp remarks and disdain for societal norms made her an enigma Ellie couldn't ignore. Henry, the youngest Branwell, was perhaps the most pitiable. His bloodshot eyes and jittery hands spoke of a man battling demons, his once handsome features marred by sleepless nights and regret. Ellie wasted no time and began her inquiries. She spoke to each family member separately, carefully noting their accounts of the accident. The official story was that a longtime servant, Edward Hargrove, had tragically fallen to his death from the mansion's west tower while cleaning the windows. However, the details didn't add up. Margaret claimed she was in the garden at the time, but a maid later confided to Ellie that she had seen Margaret in the study, arguing with Edward just minutes before his fall. Julia's account was equally dubious. She claimed she hadn't spoken to Edward in months, yet Ellie found a torn letter in the servants' quarters addressed to Julia, written in Edward's unmistakable handwriting. Henry, on the other hand, was too evasive to be convincing. His stammered responses and frequent glances toward his mother hinted at fear of what? Unveiling secrets. Ellie's suspicions deepened when she stumbled upon George Branwell's financial records. A ledger tucked away in his office revealed mounting debts and payments to anonymous recipients. A closer examination showed irregular transactions that pointed to connections with illicit businesses in London. When Ellie confronted George about the records, his temper flared. "My affairs are none of your concern," he snapped, his face flushed with anger. Margaret, ever the protective matriarch, intervened. "You are a guest in our home, Miss Harper," she said coldly. "I suggest you remember that." Ellie's questions were stonewalled, but the tension in the room confirmed her suspicions the Branwells were hiding something. Julia proved to be more forthcoming, though her motives were unclear. Over a cigarette on the balcony, she confessed to Ellie that she had been involved with an underground political group advocating for workers' rights. "Edward supported our cause," she admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. "He believed in justice, but maybe he knew too much." When pressed, Julia refused to elaborate, leaving Ellie to wonder whether Edward's death was an act of silence. Henry, meanwhile, was a puzzle Ellie struggled to piece together. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he revealed his struggles with addiction and hinted at being blackmailed. "I've made mistakes," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the floor, "but I am not a killer." Ellie's instincts told her he was telling the truth, or at least a version of it. The missing film reel. The breakthrough came late one night as Ellie explored the mansion's library. She stumbled upon a partially burned film reel hidden in a false compartment behind the shelf. Intrigued, she borrowed a projector from a nearby room and began piecing together the damaged footage. The grainy images that flickered onto the screen were chilling. Edward Hargrove engaged in a heated argument with George Branwell, Julia appearing in the background with a look of fear, and Margaret standing over a desk laden with documents. As the reel progressed, the scenes became more incriminating. One frame showed Edward holding a stack of papers, pointing accusingly at George. Another captured Margaret snatching the documents and setting them alight. The final frames were distorted, but Ellie could make out the silhouette of a figure falling from a great height, presumably Edward's fatal plunge. The implications were staggering. The film reel suggested not only that the Branwells had something to hide, but that they were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their secret. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the reel itself was a piece of a larger puzzle. Why had it been partially destroyed? Who had tried to erase this evidence? And why hadn't they succeeded? Tension mounted. As Ellie dug deeper, the atmosphere in the Branwell estate grew increasingly hostile. The staff, once polite, became distant and uncooperative. Doors that had been left ajar were now locked, and Ellie often felt the prickling sensation of being watched. One evening, she returned to her room to find her notes scattered and her suitcase rifled through. Someone didn't want her to uncover the truth. The Branwells' behavior also shifted. George became more irritable, snapping at everyone over the smallest inconveniences. Margaret withdrew almost entirely, spending her days secluded in her chamber. Julia oscillated between defiance and fear, her sharp tongue tempered by anxious glances over her shoulder. Henry was the most alarming. His already fragile state seemed to deteriorate further, and Ellie once overheard him muttering to himself about the consequences of betrayal. A dangerous discovery. Ellie's determination led her to the estate's west tower, the site of Edward's alleged accident. Braving the crumbling staircase, She reached the top and examined the scene. The railing was splintered, but not in a way consistent with a fall. It appeared to have been deliberately weakened. Nearby, she found a scrap of fabric snagged on a protruding nyla clue that someone had been there before her. Returning to her room, Ellie meticulously reviewed her findings. The inconsistencies in the family's accounts, the burned film reel, the financial records, and the evidence at the West Tower all pointed to one conclusion. Edward Hargrove's death was no accident. The Branwells were involved, but the extent of their culpability remained unclear. Ellie's resolve hardened. She was no longer just chasing a story. She was seeking justice for Edward and uncovering a conspiracy that ran deeper than she had imagined. Little did she know, her investigation was about to take a far more dangerous turn. The twist, a deeper conspiracy. The second death had been swift and unexpected, almost too swift. It was only a few days after the first shocking incident that another body was discovered at the Branwell estate. This time, it was one of the household staff, a middle-aged servant named Edith. She was found in the garden, her body lying unnaturally still beneath a magnolia tree. The official verdict was that it had been an accident, a tragic fall, perhaps, caused by the slippery dew-covered ground in the early morning hours. But as Ellie Harper stood over the body, staring down at the unnatural angle of Edith's neck, she couldn't help but feel that something was horribly wrong. Ellie had arrived at the estate under the pretense of covering a minor tragedy. A servant's death at the Branwell home, after all, was hardly going to send shockwaves through the press. But Ellie, who had spent her career digging into the darkest corners of society, knew that this was no ordinary accident. There were too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies. The first death had been a spark, and now, with Edith's untimely demise, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn deeper into a sinister web. Her instincts were sharp. She had learned early in her career that every detail mattered. The way Edith's body had been found, positioned so that it looked like a natural fall, seemed almost too perfect, as though someone had staged. Ellie's suspicion grew when she learned that Edith had been one of the few servants who had been with the Branwells for years. She had seen too much, known too much. Could Edith have been silenced to keep her quiet? Determined to find out, Ellie pushed harder. She began speaking to the other servants, gathering fragments of gossip and stories that seemed to point to something darker beneath the surface of the Branwell family. And that was when she met Arthur Cole again. Arthur, the rival journalist with a sharp smile and an even sharper agenda, had shown up at the estate, much to Ellie's surprise. He had a reputation for taking underhanded approaches to his stories, often stepping on others to climb higher on the journalistic ladder. The two had clashed in the past, but this time, there was something different about him. There was a hint of something desperate in his eyes, an edge to his charm that was hard to ignore. "What are you doing here, Cole?" Ellie asked, her voice betraying no hint of the unease she felt. She had caught him sneaking into the Branwell study, his movements too calculated, too furtive to be innocent. Arthur flashed her that knowing smile of his. "Just trying to find the truth, Harper. You should try it sometime," he teased, though there was a hardness in his voice. Ellie raised an eyebrow, her skepticism growing. "The truth? Is that what you are after? Or are you just trying to make sure you get your own version of it before anyone else?" Arthur's smile faltered for just a second, enough for Ellie to see the brief flicker of something unspoken between them. "Careful with your accusations, Ellie. You wouldn't want to make an enemy of someone who's been in this business as long as I have," he warned, before stepping past her and heading deeper into the estate. She watched him leave, her mind turning over what she had just witnessed. She had seen Cole work before, always playing the game with a self-serving cunning, but this was different. There was something almost too eager about his presence here. Could he have been involved in the conspiracy she was uncovering? Was he here to bury the truth, or to dig it up for himself? Before she could dwell too much on that question, a more pressing issue caught her attention. The death of Edith was now the second tragedy to befall the Branwell estate. But what if it wasn't an accident? What if Edith, like the others, had been caught in the middle of something far darker. Ellie was growing convinced that the Branwells were hiding something so significant that it had already cost 2 lives. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Ellie sought out Inspector Graham Larkin. The meticulous detective, whose cold, calculating logic was always a step ahead of everyone else, was her ally in this investigation. Ellie had come to trust his instincts over the years, and right now, she needed his insight more than ever. "Larkin," Ellie said, meeting him in the Branwell study, "I think we're dealing with something much bigger than just a couple of deaths." Larkin's sharp eyes never left the case file in front of him. "I know," he replied, his voice steady, "and I think I've found something that confirms it." Ellie leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What have you found?" The inspector handed her a piece of paperone that had clearly been cut from a larger sheet. It was an old, crumpled note, written in hurried ink, its meaning unclear at first glance. But as Ellie scanned the letters, a chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just a random piece of information. This was a clue. "It's from the typewriter in the Branwell study," Larkin explained. "I found it hidden inside the ribbon. Someone didn't want this to be found." Ellie felt a sudden weight in her chest as she read the message. It was a cryptic series of letters, a code, but one that didn't take long for her to decipher. It linked the murders at the Branwell estate to something far larger, an extensive network of corruption that reached all the way to the heart of London's elite. The typewriter ribbon had been the key to unlocking the mystery, and now Ellie and Larkin had the first piece of the puzzle. "This is it," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is what they were trying to keep hidden." Inspector Larkin nodded grimly. "It's bigger than the Branwells. It involves illegal trade, money laundering, the kind of things that could bring down the entire city if the right people found out." Ellie's mind raced. She could feel the walls of the Branwell estate closing in around her, and for the first time in her career, she realized that the story she was chasing wasn't just about a family's secrets, it was about a conspiracy that could change everything. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous things became. Someone with power was determined to stop her from uncovering the truth. Ellie could feel it in the air, in the way the Branwells watched her with cold, calculating eyes. They were beginning to realize that she was onto something, and they would stop at nothing to keep her from exposing it. The final twist, however, came when Ellie made one last discovery, one that changed everything she thought she knew. She was sifting through a pile of old papers in the Branwell study when she found a photograph, a faded image of the Branwell family from years ago. But there was something strange about it, a shadowy figure standing behind them, barely visible, but unmistakably present. It was the same figure that had been seen in the background of the mansion's windows during the first death. Could this person be the key to everything? Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that she wasn't just hunting for the truth. She was hunting for a person, someone who had been manipulating the events all along, pulling the strings from the shadows. And unless she found them, the Branwells' deadly game would continue. The hunt had only just begun. Climax. The puzzle unraveled. The tension had been building for days. Ellie Harper and Inspector Graham Larkin had finally connected the dots. What had started as a seemingly innocent investigation into a series of tragic deaths had morphed into something far darker, far more dangerous than either of them had ever imagined. The deaths were no mere accidents, they were meticulously orchestrated murders, designed to silence those who were about to expose the Branwell family's deepest secrets. It had taken weeks of meticulous digging, a web of secrets, betrayals, and coded messages. But finally, they had pieced together the puzzle. The Branwell estate, with its towering walls and lush, serene gardens, hid a nightmare beneath its tranquil exterior. The murders were not random, nor were they simply the result of a family's internal conflicts. No, These deaths were part of a much larger plan conspiracy that ran deeper than even the British elite could have imagined. At the heart of the scheme was illegal trade money laundering, the smuggling of rare and priceless artifacts, and a covert network of corruption involving some of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in London. The Branwell family, with its glittering reputation and political connections, had been at the center of this operation. But as Ellie and Larkin dug deeper, they discovered something even more shocking. The murders weren't just about covering up the trade, they were about protecting the one person who had the power to expose everything. And that person was none other than Arthur Cole, the rival journalist who had been following them all along. Arthur had known about the conspiracy for months. He had been playing both sides, ingratiating himself with the Branwells while simultaneously working as a double agent, feeding information to the corrupt network. He was, in every sense, the mastermind behind the death-spulling strings, setting the stage for the murders, and using his charm to manipulate everyone around him. It was all a game to him, a high-stakes game where the truth was a weapon, and the stakes were higher than anyone had realized. Ellie's heart raced as she looked at the evidence in front of her. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Arthur Cole had been at the center of everything from the very beginning. The manipulative journalist who had seemed so charming, so helpful, had been the killer all along. "Everything leads back to him," Ellie whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "Arthur, he's the one pulling the strings." Larkin's face was grim as he nodded. It was all part of his plan. The Branwells were just pawns. The real game was about silencing anyone who got too close to the truth, especially the whistleblowers who were about to expose the entire network. Edith's death, the servants, the accidents, they were all distractions. Ellie felt a surge of anger rise within her. She had been used, manipulated by a man she had trusted, a man who had played her like a puppet in his own twisted game. But she wasn't about to let him get away with it. The truth would come to light, no matter the cost. The final showdown was set. The Branwells were hosting an extravagant gala at the estate, a night of opulence and luxury that seemed to mock the very deaths that had taken place in the shadows of their home. It was the perfect stage for Arthur's grand reveal, the ultimate climax of his carefully constructed deception. It was also the perfect moment for Ellie and Larkin to confront him and expose the conspiracy to the world. The gala hall glittered with crystal chandeliers and gilded walls, the air thick with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. The elite of London were in attendance, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they wined and dined under the glow of opulent candlelight. But beneath the surface of wealth and privilege, Ellie knew that tonight, everything would unravel. She had prepared for this moment for days. She had arranged for a trusted colleague to have the evidence delivered to the press, ready to blow the lid off the Branwell family's secrets. But Ellie's instincts told her that Arthur wouldn't go down quietly. He would fight back, and this time, he would have no choice but to reveal his true face. Ellie and Larkin made their way through the crowd, carefully navigating the sea of glittering socialites. The tension in the air was palpable, and Ellie could feel her pulse quickening as she neared the center of the ballroom. Arthur was there too, charming the guests with his disarming smile and practiced ease. He was playing his part to perfection, as he always did. But Ellie could see the cracks beneath the surface, the nervous glances, the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to come after him. Ellie knew the time had come. She walked up to him with purpose, and as soon as their eyes met, she saw the flicker of recognition in his gaze. He knew she had figured it all out. "Arthur," Ellie said coolly, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowd, "we need to talk." Arthur's smile faltered for just a moment. "Ellie, my dear, it's so nice to see you," he said smoothly, though the edge in his voice was unmistakable. Ellie didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know everything," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I know what you've been doing. I know about the murders, the conspiracy, the corruption. It's over, Arthur." For a brief moment, there was silence. The world seemed to pause as the weight of her words hung in the air. Then, Arthur's smile returned, but this time, it was different, cold, calculating. He leaned in closer, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement. "But you've underestimated me, Ellie. You've always underestimated me." Before she could react, a sharp cry pierced the air. The guests around them turned in confusion, and Ellie felt her stomach drop as she saw Arthur's hand reach into his coat pocket. He had a gun. Time seemed to slow as Ellie instinctively stepped back, grabbing Larkin's arm to pull him out of the line of fire. Arthur's eyes gleamed with madness as he raised the weapon, pointing it at them. But before he could fire, a loud crash echoed through the ballroom, and a flurry of movement erupted around them. The gunshot never came. Instead, a shadow moved too fast for anyone to react, and with a swift motion, the gun was knocked from Arthur's hand. It was Larkin. He had acted faster than anyone had expected. The detective, with his unflinching precision, had disarmed Arthur in a heartbeat. In the chaos that followed, security rushed in, and within seconds, Arthur Cole was surrounded, restrained, and dragged away. Ellie's heart was racing, her breath shallow as she watched the scene unfold. It was over. The killer had been unmasked. Arthur Cole, the charming, enigmatic journalist, was revealed for the monster he truly was. But as Arthur was led away in handcuffs, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the game was far from over. There was a deeper, darker force at play here that would not be silenced so easily. The Branwell family's web of lies had been exposed, but somewhere in the shadows, there was still someone pulling the strings. And as Ellie stood there, victorious but wary, she knew that the story was far from finished. Resolution. Shadows lifted. The cold, London night was thick with fog, creeping through the narrow alleys and hugging the cobblestone streets like a suffocating blanket. But inside the Branwell estate, the weight of the secrets that had haunted its walls for decades was finally being lifted. The mansion, once the symbol of wealth and power, now felt like a tomb. The windows, which had once gleamed with the reflections of laughter and clinking glasses, now stared out over the estate like the eyes of a silent, watching sentinel. The grandiose ballroom, where the final confrontation had taken place, now felt hollow and lifeless. The guests who had once mingled among the high society of London had dispersed, leaving only the echoes of their whispered conversations behind. Arthur Cole, the brilliant, ruthless journalist, was behind bars. His charming demeanor, which had once disarmed even the sharpest minds, was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. His face had lost its charm, revealing the true darkness that had lurked behind his polished exterior. The murderer, the architect of the conspiracy, was caught. The Branwell family, too, was reeling from the revelations. Their carefully constructed facade had crumbled, exposing the rot that had been festering within their veins for far too long. But while justice had been served in the form of Arthur's arrest, there was still an unsettling quiet in the air. The case that had taken so much of Ellie's strength and determination was finally over, but Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the end was only an illusion. Ellie Harper stood in the center of her modest newsroom, holding the latest edition of the Daily Chronicle in her hands. The headline screamed the truth. Branwell family exposed in high-level corruption and murder scandal. Her story, the one she had fought so tirelessly to uncover, was now in print for the world to see. She couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. For months, she had risked everything: her career, her safety, her sanity to unearth the truth about the Branwells. It had taken her to dark, dangerous places she never thought she would go, but in the end, it had been worth it. Her phone buzzed on her desk, Ellie picked it up and read the message. It was from her editor. "Ellie, this is one of the best pieces I've ever seen. The whole world is reading your story right now. You've secured your place in the annals of journalistic history." Ellie's heart swelled. This was the moment she had been working toward. The moment when her name would be forever associated with uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. She had done it. But as the thrill of victory washed over her, Ellie couldn't help but feel a chill creeping up her spine. There was something missing, something nagging at the back of her mind. Arthur Cole had been caught, the Branwell estate had been exposed, and the dark web of corruption was laid bare for all to see. Yet the puzzle wasn't complete. Ellie couldn't shake the haunting thought that someone else, someone far more powerful, was still lurking in the shadows. Justice served. The press had already begun to celebrate. Arthur Cole's arrest was splashed across the front pages of every major newspaper in London. His fall from grace was swift and unforgiving. The once celebrated journalist, who had rubbed elbows with the elite and whose words had been laced with charm and intrigue, was now nothing more than a criminal. His story had gone from one of success and influence to one of scandal, betrayal, and bloodshed. The Branwell family, too, was in the spotlight. George Branwell, the patriarch, was facing severe public scrutiny over his involvement in the illegal trade and money laundering. His name, once synonymous with high society and power, was now being dragged through the mud. His wife, Margaret, could no longer shield him from the media's unrelenting gaze. Julia and Henry Branwell, their rebellious daughter and troubled son, had both been implicated in the family's criminal dealings. Their lives were now marred by their connections to the corruption that had tainted their family's legacy. For the people of London, it was a satisfying conclusion. A corrupt journalist and a wealthy, powerful family had been exposed for what they truly were. The powerful had been taken down, and the truth had triumphed. But for Ellie, the victory felt hollow. Ellie's triumph. Sitting in her small, cluttered office, Ellie looked out the window at the bustling streets of London. The fog had begun to lift, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the world felt clear. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her mother. Ellie had been so consumed with her investigation that she hadn't had time to speak to her in weeks. "Ellie, darling, I saw your story in the paper," her mother said with a voice full of pride. "You've done it, haven't you? You've exposed the truth. I am so proud of you." Ellie smiled softly, a wave of warmth washing over her. She had done it. She had fought for justice, for the truth, and had come out victorious. But the feeling of triumph was bittersweet. As she set the phone down, Ellie's mind wandered back to the shadows. The investigation had begun with a death at the Branwell estate, but it had led to a conspiracy so deep that it had shaken the very foundations of London's elite. Ellie had exposed everything, had given the public a glimpse into the dark underbelly of power and corruption, but it hadn't been enough. The mastermind, the one who had orchestrated it all, was still out there, and Ellie could feel their presence, a shadow hovering just beyond her reach. She couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after everything she had sacrificed. Lingering mystery. As the days passed, Ellie's life began to return to some semblance of normalcy. Her story had garnered praise, and her career was on the rise. But there was something unsettling in the air, something Ellie couldn't shake. A letter arrived one morning, its envelope crisp and unmarked. No return address, just her name, written in a neat, almost elegant script. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she opened it. Inside was a single sentence, written in black ink. "You have only uncovered the surface. The game is far from over." Her fingers trembled as she read the words again. It was a warning, a threat. Whoever had sent it knew, Herc knew what she had uncovered. They were watching, waiting. And the chilling thought struck Ellie. The person behind the conspiracy was still out there, untouched by the justice that had been served. The letter was signed with a symbol, one Ellie had seen before, hidden in the Branwell family's records. It was the symbol of a secret society, a network that ran deeper and farther than anyone had realized. The game was not over. The shadows had lifted, but they had only revealed a glimpse of the true darkness beneath. Artistic and dynamic features. The shadowy streets of 1930s London, with its smoky air and dimly lit alleys, had set the stage for Ellie's journey into the heart of a conspiracy. From the bustling newsroom, filled with the clatter of typewriters and the sharp scent of ink, to the eerie, decaying Branwell estate, the world of Ellie's investigation was painted with vivid strokes of atmosphere. Each scene, whether in the foggy streets of London or the opulent halls of the Branwell estate, was drenched in suspense and mystery, evoking a sense of dread that mirrored Ellie's own unease. The characters, too, were complex and multi-dimensional. George Branwell's stoic exterior hid a man desperate to preserve his family's legacy, while Margaret Branwell's protective instincts masked a deep well of guilt and fear. Julia and Henry, rebellious and troubled, revealed cracks in the perfect family facade, their dark secrets only adding to the tension. But it was Arthur Cole who stole the show, his charm and ruthlessness blending seamlessly to create a villain whose fall from grace was as dramatic as it was inevitable. Every twist and turn kept the reader on their toes. The trail of clues misleading, hidden, and obscured kept Ellie and the reader guessing. The line between loyalty and betrayal was blurred at every corner, and Ellie's personal ambition conflicted with her moral responsibility, making every decision a struggle between personal gain and the greater good. The case was solved, but the story was far from over. For Ellie Harper, the shadows were just beginning to lift.
Do you know what power sounds like? Lord Reginald Fairfax's voice sliced through the ballroom like the opening note of a symphony, commanding an immediate, reverent silence. The hum of laughter and the clink of crystal glasses died in unison as the room turned toward their host. His silhouette, framed by the opulent glow of the chandelier above, exuded an air of grandeur that could only belong to a man both worshipped and feared. The spotlight fell squarely upon him, and behind him, resting in its glass sanctum, was the masterpiece of the evening, the star of eternity. The jewel's brilliance was mesmerizing, a deep, otherworldly blue that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Even from afar, one could swear they saw galaxies swirling within its crystalline depths. As Fairfax spoke, his ivory cane tapped against the marble floor in perfect rhythm with his words, each tap resonating like a heartbeat. "It sounds," he continued, his voice rising to fill every corner of the grand hall, "like the heartbeat of eternity itself." He gestured with a sweeping motion toward the jewel, his embroidered waistcoat catching the light in a cascade of gold. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone steeped in theatrical gravitas, "tonight you are not merely witnesses to its brilliance, but custodians of its legend." A ripple of murmurs coursed through the crowd, a wave of whispered awe mingled with skepticism. At the back of the room, a man in a sharp black suit leaned toward his companion and murmured with a smirk, "Custodians? He's laying it on thick. More like spectators to a well-polished show." Fairfax's sharp eyes, glinting with the cunning of a man who thrived on command, scanned the crowd. Even the faintest murmur seemed to fall silent under his gaze. He took a deliberate step forward, his cane tapping once more. "The star of eternity is not merely a jewel," he said, his voice now a low, sonorous rumble. "It is the culmination of centuries, battles fought, kingdoms toppled, lives sacrificed, all for this single fragment of the infinite. Do you not feel it?" He paused, letting the room hang in a collective breath. "Do you not hear it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper now, yet somehow carrying as clearly as a shout. He turned to face the jewel, his cane lifted to point at its pulsating heart. The heartbeat of ambition, the rhythm of history itself. The applause began hesitantly, a smattering of claps at first, before cascading into a thunderous ovation. Fairfax turned back to the crowd, a satisfied smile gracing his lips. He raised his glass of champagne high. To beauty, to ambition, to the indomitable spirit of humankind. But as the crowd toasted and the orchestra resumed its melody, another story began to unfold, quietly and invisibly, in the corners untouched by the spotlight. Far across the grand hall, where golden light faded into the dim edges of obscurity, a figure emerged from the shadows. The intruder moved like a wisp of smoke, silent, fluid, and deliberate. Draped in black from head to toe, they blended seamlessly with the darkness, their face obscured by a sleek mask. Every step was calculated, every movement precise, as if rehearsed 100 times over. They paused near a gilded column, their eyes, sharp and predatory, locking onto the jewel. From their vantage point, the star of eternity seemed almost within reach, its brilliance like a siren's call. But the figure did not rush. Patience was their ally, and haste their enemy. They reached into the folds of their dark clothing and retrieved a small device, no larger than a pocket watch. A soft blue light blinked to life on its surface, casting a faint glow onto the gloved hand that held it. The thief's gaze shifted, scanning the room with the meticulous precision of a chess master surveying the board. Guests laughed, danced, and toasted, oblivious to the shadow in their midst. Security guards stood at strategic points, their postures stiff, and their eyes alert but unseeing. The thief's lips curved into a faint smile beneath the mask. It was almost too easy. They activated the device with a subtle twist, and a barely perceptible hum emanated from it. Across the room, in the hidden recesses of the treasure display, a series of tiny mechanisms began to whir. The thief moved again, their path carefully choreographed to avoid drawing attention. Each step brought them closer to the jewel's pedestal, closer to the prize. Meanwhile, at the center of the ballroom, Fairfax basked in the glow of his guests' admiration. He moved through the crowd like a conductor through an orchestra, exchanging pleasantries, accepting compliments, and reveling in his moment of triumph. But beneath the surface of his polished exterior lay a mind as sharp as the facets of the star of eternity. Fairfax was no fool. He knew that with great treasure came great risk. "Marvelous piece, Reginald," said Lady Celeste Montague, a renowned art collector, as she examined the jewel from a respectful distance. "I must admit, I envy your audacity in displaying it so openly." Fairfax chuckled, his laugh rich and indulgent. "Ah, my dear Celeste, fortune favors the bold," he said, tapping his cane against the floor for emphasis. "Besides, the star of eternity deserves to be admired. What is beauty if it remains hidden?" "What indeed?" Celeste mused, her tone thoughtful. Her gaze lingered on the jewel, a glimmer of something unspoken in her eyes. "But tell me, Reginald, have you considered what might happen if someone decided they wanted it for themselves?" Fairfax's smile did not waver, but his grip on the cane tightened imperceptibly. "Let them try," he said smoothly. "The star is well protected. It would take a genius, or a madman, to even dream of stealing it." As he spoke, the thief reached the edge of the treasure room. They crouched low, their movements now slower and more deliberate. The blue light of their device pulsed in sync with the jewel's heartbeat, a silent dialogue between machine and treasure. The glass casing emitted a soft click as its locks disengaged, the sound swallowed by the music and laughter of the gala. The thief rose to their full height, their gloved hand hovering inches above the star of eternity. For a moment, they hesitated, as if contemplating the enormity of what they were about to do. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, they plucked the jewel from its cradle. Its weight was surprising, heavier than they had expected, as if the burden of its history clung to it. An alarm should have sounded. Guards should have rushed in, but there was only silence. The thief slipped the jewel into a concealed pouch and melted back into the shadows, their exit as seamless as their entry. Back in the ballroom, Fairfax raised his glass once more, his voice booming with confidence. "To the star of eternity," he proclaimed, "a beacon of hope and ambition for generations to come." The crowd erupted in cheers, oblivious to the fact that the jewel, the star of the evening, was already gone. The thief, now a ghost among the revelers, moved toward the exit, their heart pounding in their chest. The star of eternity was theirs, but the night was far from over. The game had only just begun. Moments later, the gala descended into chaos. A high-pitched scream sliced through the opulent ballroom, halting the string quartet mid-note. Crystal glasses froze mid-air, and the buzz of laughter was replaced by an eerie silence. All heads turned toward the treasure room as a maid burst into the room, her face as pale as moonlight and her chest heaving with panic. "It's gone," she cried, clutching at her apron like a lifeline. "The jewel is gone." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a moment, the room stood frozen, a tableau of shock and disbelief. Then, like a dam breaking, gasps and murmurs surged through the crowd. Guests rushed toward the treasure room, their elegant shoes clicking against the marble floor. Questions flew like arrows, laced with suspicion and confusion. Gone? What does she mean, gone? Who could have taken it? Wasn't there security? In the midst of the turmoil, two figures remained conspicuously composed. Seated inconspicuously near the back of the ballroom, Tommy and Tuppence Beresford exchanged a knowing glance. While others were swept up in the frenzy, the duo watched with calm, calculating eyes, their years of experience as amateur detectives sharpening their instincts. Tuppence, with the grace of a seasoned observer, adjusted her pearl necklace and leaned toward her partner. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Well, darling," she said, her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention, "it seems our evening just got a bit more interesting." Tommy's response was equally measured. He leaned back in his chair, arms resting casually on the armrests as though he were watching a play unfold. A wry smile tugged at his lips. "Indeed," he replied. "Shall we see what's afoot?" Without another word they rose, their movements unhurried yet deliberate. Like shadows they slipped through the crowd, weaving past clusters of agitated guests. Their eyes, sharp as hawks, took in every detail, every trembling hand, every furtive glance, every bead of sweat betraying anxiety. The Beresfords were masters of observation, and tonight the ballroom was their hunting ground. As they approached the treasure room, the scene before them came into view. The glass case that once held the Star of Eternity was shattered, its fragments scattered like frozen tears across the pedestal. A velvet cloth, once pristine, now lay crumpled and empty. The jewel, the crowning glory of the evening, was gone. Tommy crouched near the pedestal, his fingers brushing lightly against the shards of glass. He frowned, his mind working like a finely tuned machine. "The glass is broken inward," he muttered, almost to himself. "Odd. If someone smashed it to grab the jewel, you'd expect it to shatter outward." Tuppence, standing beside him, cast her gaze over the gathered guests. She didn't look at the display. Instead, she studied the faces of those around her. Panic, disbelief, curiosity, the emotions played out like an open book. But it was the subtle ones she sought, the glances too quick to notice, the expressions too carefully composed. Her eyes narrowed as she caught sight of Lord Reginald Fairfax, who stood near the center of the crowd, his face pale, but his jaw set. "Reginald looks unnerved," Tuppence remarked, her tone as calm as if she were commenting on the weather. "More than a man merely shocked by theft. Wouldn't you say, Tommy?" Tommy straightened, brushing glass dust from his fingers. "He does," he agreed, his voice thoughtful. "But then a man in his position would have much to lose. It doesn't necessarily make him guilty." "No, but it makes him interesting," Tuppence replied, her eyes glinting with curiosity. The arrival of the head of security interrupted their quiet exchange. A burly man with a stern expression and a badge that gleamed under the chandeliers pushed his way through the throng. He barked orders to his team, who began cordoning off the area around the display. "Nobody leaves the premises until we've conducted a full investigation," he announced, his voice firm and unyielding. "Lord Fairfax, I'll need to speak with you first." Fairfax nodded, his composure returning with practiced ease. "Of course," he said, though his voice carried a faint edge of irritation. "This is an outrage. The Star of Eternity was meant to inspire awe, not this." As the security team began their work, Tommy and Tuppence exchanged another glance. The scene was becoming a theater of drama, and they knew how to read every act. "Shall we start with Reginald?" Tommy asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Not yet," Tuppence replied. "Let's see who's watching him. Sometimes the shadows reveal more than the light." Together, they melted back into the crowd, their attention now split between the guests and the unfolding investigation. Somewhere in the chaos lay the truth, and the Beresfords were determined to find it. The grand library of Lord Fairfax's mansion had transformed into an impromptu theater of suspicion. The high, vaulted ceilings loomed overhead like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Shelves lined with ancient tomes and glimmering artifacts seemed to hold their breath, as though even they knew the gravity of the moment. At the center of it all stood Lord Reginald Fairfax, his ivory cane tapping rhythmically against the polished mahogany floor as he addressed the room. "No one leaves until the thief is caught," he declared, his voice a blend of authority and desperation. "The Star of Eternity is irreplaceable, a symbol of my family's legacy and a masterpiece of immeasurable worth. Whoever has taken it will face the full weight of justice." His gaze swept over the room, landing on each of the gathered individuals. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Standing in the spotlight of suspicion were 5 figures, each as enigmatic as the next. Lady Isabella Hartley, a vision of elegance in her emerald gown, Lady Isabella's beauty was as sharp as her wit. She leaned casually against a bookshelf, her jeweled fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound volume. Her expression was one of mild irritation, as though the entire situation were an inconvenience to her evening. But her eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed something deeper. "Honestly, Reginald," she drawled, her voice dripping with disdain, "are we truly expected to sit here and play detectives? Surely your security staff can handle this little debacle." "Mr. Bernard Thorne." Across from her stood Bernard Thorne, a rival collector and perennial thorn in Lord Fairfax's side. His silver hair was impeccably combed, his tailored suit the epitome of sophistication. Yet there was an air of smugness about him that set everyone's teeth on edge. He toyed with the end of his silk pocket square, a sly smile playing on his lips. "Little debacle?" he echoed, his voice oozing mockery. "Lady Hartley, this little debacle has robbed us all of witnessing one of history's greatest jewels. A tragedy, indeed." His tone suggested anything but tragedy, and his eyes gleamed with an amusement that didn't sit right with anyone. Miss Evelyn Porter. In stark contrast to their cool composure was Evelyn Porter, the maid whose scream had set the entire mansion into uproar. She stood near the doorway, her hands clutching the hem of her apron as though it might anchor her trembling frame. Her wide eyes darted nervously around the room, and her voice was a timid whisper when she spoke. I swear I didn't see anyone," she stammered. I just went in to tidy up, and the jewel was gone. I don't know how it happened." Colonel Archibald Blake. Colonel Blake, a retired military man with a face carved from stone, stood stiffly by the fireplace. His medals gleamed in the firelight, a testament to his decades of service. Yet his eyes, fixed on the flames, were curiously blank, as though his mind were elsewhere. When he finally spoke, his voice was gruff and deliberate. "This is no time for dithering," he said, his tone commanding. "Whoever did this had a plan, a motive, and, likely, an accomplice. The sooner we establish who had the most to gain, the better." Tommy and Tuppence Beresford, seated off to the side, inconspicuous but alert, Tommy and Tuppence Beresford watched the scene unfold with quiet intensity. They'd seen their fair share of mysteries, and this one promised to be no less intriguing. Tuppence's eyes darted from one suspect to the next, cataloging every twitch, every micro-expression. Tommy, ever the strategist, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin as he processed the unfolding drama. "Quite the cast of characters," Tuppence murmured under her breath, her lips barely moving. Tommy's eyes didn't waver from Bernard Thorne. "Indeed," he replied softly, "and each with a motive, I'd wager. The question is, who had the nerve to act on it?" Lord Fairfax's cane struck the floor sharply, reclaiming everyone's attention. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said firmly. "Until then, no one is above suspicion." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Each suspect, whether out of guilt, indignation, or fear, wore a mask of their own making. And yet, behind those masks, Tommy and Tuppence knew, lay the truth. It was only a matter of time before it surfaced. "Well, darling," Tuppence said, her voice light but her eyes sharp, "shall we begin?" Tommy's lips curved into a faint smile. "By all means, let's see who cracks first." The air in the room felt charged with tension as Tommy's sharp eyes scanned the wreckage of the shattered glass case. Among the sparkling shards of broken glass, his gaze fixed on an unusual detail. A small, torn piece of red fabric, clinging desperately to the jagged edge of the display. His hand instinctively reached out, touching it carefully as he inspected the delicate tear in the cloth. "Interesting," Tommy muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He examined the fabric more closely, his mind racing. The thief was in a rush, no doubt about it. A hurried escape left this behind. But why was it so badly torn? Was it snagged while they were making off with the jewel? Or did it tear on purpose? The possibilities began to swirl in his mind as he stood up, his thoughts already racing ahead. But before he could speak, Tuppence's sharp eyes locked on another movement across the room. She had been observing Lady Hartley, who had seemed to be at ease amid the chaos, but now Tuppence noticed something peculiar. The lady's fingers slipped subtly into her purse, a quick, almost imperceptible gesture. Tuppence narrowed her gaze, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "Quite a bold move, don't you think?" she whispered to Tommy, her voice full of quiet determination. "She's hiding something. Let's keep an eye on her. We'll see if she slips up." The room buzzed with murmurs as the suspects began to gather in one corner, all under the watchful eyes of Tommy and Tuppence. The interviews were about to begin, and it quickly became clear that this would not be an easy task. The truth felt elusive, like a shadow dancing just out of reach. Each suspect offered contradictions that seemed to multiply with every word. Lady Hartley was the first to speak. Her demeanor was cool and composed, an aristocratic air that hinted at a life of privilege. "I was simply admiring the ballroom decor," she explained, her voice smooth and calm. Her gaze lingered briefly on the opulent surroundings, as though to reaffirm her own elegance. The flowers, the chandeliers, the arrangement of colors, all so delightful. But as for the artist behind that magnificent painting near the jewels— She paused, a slight hesitation flashing in her eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know. It didn't matter to me at the time." Tommy studied her intently, noticing the slight shift in her tone. How odd, he thought. A woman so immersed in culture and refinement couldn't possibly miss such an iconic painting, especially when it stood so prominently beside the jewels. Was she lying? Or had she truly never taken the time to notice? There was something about her that felt rehearsed, as though she were reciting a carefully crafted narrative. Then there was Mr. Thorne. From the moment Tommy began questioning him, the man's unease was palpable. He was too eager to answer, his words tumbling out in an unsteady rush. "It wasn't me," he practically shouted, his eyes darting from one person to the next. "I swear, it's Colonel Blake, it's gotta be him. He was always standing so close to the display, hovering around the case like he was waiting for something." His hands were flailing now, pointing erratically in the direction of the colonel. "You must believe me, I saw him. He had a strange look in his eye, like he knew what was going to happen." Tommy raised an eyebrow. Thorne's frantic behavior was telling in itself. The way his voice cracked under pressure, how his accusations seemed to shift blame with every passing second. There was a nervous energy to him, a desperation that didn't match the calm demeanor of someone telling the truth. Could it be that he was trying to deflect attention from himself? Or was he simply too guilty to keep his story straight? Next up was Miss Porter. She was visibly shaken from the moment she sat down. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, and her hands were twisting together nervously. I was just walking by," she stammered, her voice small and trembling. "I didn't see anything. I wasn't paying attention to the display at all. I don't know what happened." She looked down at the floor, her gaze never meeting theirs. "I wasn't near the case. No, I swear." Tommy's mind raced. Her reaction felt too extreme for someone who was innocent. The way she avoided eye contact, how her words stuttered and faltered. There was more to this than she was willing to admit. Was she hiding a guilty conscience? Or had she witnessed something she wasn't prepared to speak of? Then, finally, there was Colonel Blake. Unlike the others, he remained eerily calm, almost too calm. He sat upright, his posture rigid, his hands clasped together in his lap. His responses were short, his tone clipped, as though he were deliberately keeping his distance from the conversation. "I wasn't near the case," he said flatly, his gaze unwavering, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I don't know what you're implying. I've been here the entire time, minding my own business. No need to look my way." But Tommy was far from convinced. There was something about Blake's cold, stoic demeanor that didn't add up. The colonel's eyes, though steady, betrayed a flicker of something darker. Was it guilt or simply the weariness of a man who had learned how to hide his emotions? His reluctance to speak in detail, his avoidance of direct answers, everything screamed that he was hiding something. But what? As the interviews drew to a close, Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a look that said it all. The contradictions had piled up, and with them, the web of lies seemed to grow ever more tangled. No one was telling the whole truth, and every suspect seemed to be hiding something. perhaps even more than they knew themselves. The puzzle was far from solved. But one thing was certain. The deeper they dug, the more complex the mystery became. The air in the mansion was thick with mystery, each room seemingly holding its own secrets, waiting to be uncovered. As Tommy and Tuppence continued their exploration, they ventured deeper into the sprawling hallways, where the only sounds were the creaks of old wooden floors and the soft flicker of Tommy's lantern. The walls were lined with tapestries, their rich colors faded from years of exposure, yet still possessing an undeniable grandeur. As Tommy walked ahead, his lantern's glow caught something unusual, a faint, almost imperceptible draft that seemed to whisper from behind one of the tapestries. He stopped in his tracks, his sharp eyes narrowing as he turned to investigate further. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out and tugged at the edge of the ornate fabric. A soft creak echoed through the silence, and to Tommy's surprise, the tapestry shifted aside, revealing a hidden door, old, weathered, and inconspicuous. The draft was coming from within, teasing with the promise of a secret yet to be revealed. Tommy's eyes widened with excitement, his mustache twitching as he let out a low chuckle. "This just got even more interesting," he said, his voice full of both surprise and exhilaration. There was a glimmer of triumph in his eyes, as though the walls of the mansion were finally beginning to give up their long-held secrets. With a firm push, Tommy opened the door, and it groaned in protest, revealing a narrow, dimly lit passageway that stretched out before them like a path leading into the unknown. The air was stale and heavy, and the walls of the passage were lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to have long since surrendered to time. "This is definitely not part of the main house," Tuppence murmured, her voice full of awe. "Where does it lead?" Tommy's gaze never left the passage as he nodded. "That's what we're about to find out." The narrow corridor twisted and turned, winding its way beneath the mansion, until they finally emerged into a small, dusty study. The room was cluttered with the weight of time, old photographs scattered on a rickety desk, yellowed letters spilling out of a drawer, and bookshelves crammed with faded volumes that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. The room seemed to hold a quiet reverence for the forgotten stories of the past. But what really caught Tommy's attention was the object resting on the desk, a detailed sketch of something unmistakable. It was the Star of Eternity, the very same jewel they had been investigating, its intricate design captured with the precision of a master artist. The sketch was shaded in deep, rich lines, the shape and facets of the jewel coming to life on the yellowed paper. Tommy leaned in closer, his heart racing. This is no coincidence," he murmured, his fingers gently brushing over the image. "Someone's been here before us, and they were very interested in the star." Tuppence stood behind him, her expression serious as she took in the sketch. "But why hide it in a room like this? And who's been sketching it? It's almost like they knew the jewel would be the key." The room felt heavy with unanswered questions, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The hidden passage had led them straight into the heart of the mystery, and now the walls of this forgotten study whispered secrets of their own. Secrets that could finally reveal the truth behind the Star of Eternity and its disappearance. Tommy's eyes sparkled with determination. "We're getting closer, Tuppence. Much closer." The evening was heavy with tension as the dinner party progressed, the air thick with unspoken questions. The grand chandelier above cast a soft glow over the guests, but beneath the lavish elegance, something darker was at play. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged subtle, knowing glances from across the room. They had the pieces of the puzzle, and now it was time to put them all together. The moment arrived in a dramatic rush, as Tommy stood up with an air of quiet authority, his voice commanding yet measured. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping the room, "I believe the time has come for the truth to come to light." The guests, already on edge, turned their attention toward him, murmurs rippling through the room. Lady Hartley, ever poised, looked as though she might laugh at the audacity of such a claim, but even she couldn't mask the flicker of tension that crossed her face. Tommy's eyes locked with hers, and without breaking his gaze, he continued, "The thief, my friends, is none other than Lady Hartley herself." A stunned silence fell over the room, and for the briefest moment it seemed as though time had stopped. Lady Hartley's face remained still, but her eyes betrayed her, widening ever so slightly. The other guests gasped, their eyes flicking from Tommy to her in disbelief. Tuppence, standing beside Tommy, added with sharp precision, "Lady Hartley has been orchestrating this scheme for years, driven by a deep-seated vendetta, one tied to a long-forgotten family feud. It was not just about wealth, but about revenge, a grudge passed down through generations." The realization hit like a thunderclap, and Lady Hartley's poised mask began to crack. She stood, her movements slow, almost regal, as she tried to regain control of the room. But Tommy was already steps ahead. "We found the hidden passage," Tommy continued, his voice unwavering. "The very same one that allowed you to bypass the prying eyes of the manor and execute your plan in secrecy. You thought you could outsmart us, but you underestimated our keen eyes and quick minds." Tuppence took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Lady Hartley's now faltering composure. "You used that secret route to enter the study, to study the jewel closely, to make sure you could strike when the moment was right. But you didn't account for the smallest details. You never expected that we would uncover the truth so swiftly." The room held its breath as the weight of the accusation settled over Lady Hartley. Her defiant facade crumbled, and in a low, cold voice, she finally spoke. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Tommy smirked, his eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "Don't I? You left behind too many clues, the red fabric, the hidden door, the sketch of the Star of Eternity, something only someone with intimate knowledge of its value and significance could possess." Lady Hartley's hand shook as she reached for her purse, but before she could react, Tommy nodded to the butler, who swiftly retrieved the stolen Star of Eternity from its hiding place. As the jewel was placed in Lord Fairfax's hands, the atmosphere shifted. A wave of relief washed over his face, and he let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Lord Fairfax turned to Tommy, his voice full of gratitude. "I cannot thank you enough, my dear friend. You've saved my family's legacy, and I fear what might have happened if this had gone on any longer." Tommy smiled, though there was no arrogance in his expression. "It was our pleasure, Lord Fairfax. The truth always has a way of coming to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried." The guests, still reeling from the revelation, began to murmur among themselves. Some exchanged wary glances, others seemed to have trouble processing the shocking twist. But one thing was clear. Lady Hartley's web of deceit had been unraveled, and the mansion's darkest secret had been exposed. As the tension lifted and the stolen jewel was returned to its rightful place, Tommy and Tuppence stood side by side, watching the aftermath unfold. The mystery had been solved, but for the two of them, it was just another victory in the ongoing battle against the shadows of deception. As the last of the guests filtered out of the mansion, their whispers still hanging in the air like the remnants of a storm, Tommy and Tuppence stood alone in the grand hallway. The quiet that followed the evening's events was almost surreal, a strange calm after the storm of revelations. Yet something still lingered in the shadows, an unsolved riddle, a nagging feeling that even with the mystery unraveled, the story wasn't truly over. Tuppence noticed Tommy standing by the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the star of eternity, which now rested on a velvet cushion. His gaze was intense, far deeper than a simple appreciation of the jewel's beauty. She could sense his mind whirring, already lost in a new line of thought. "What is it?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence, curiosity lacing her words. Tommy didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out slowly, his fingers brushing lightly against the jewel's smooth surface, as if it held some unspoken power. Finally, he spoke, his tone carrying a hint of mystery and excitement. "I can't help but feel there's more to this story. The Star of Eternity. It's not just a jewel, Tuppence. It has a history, a story that's yet to be told. There's something about it, a hidden truth we haven't uncovered." Tuppence tilted her head, a playful smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Oh, Tommy," she teased, stepping closer to him and linking her arm with his. "You're always chasing the next mystery, aren't you? Well, darling," she continued, her voice light but filled with promise, "let's save that for another adventure. There's a whole world of secrets out there waiting for us." Tommy chuckled softly, but the glint in his eyes didn't fade. "You're right, of course, but some mysteries, well, they refuse to be left behind." He gave the jewel one last lingering glance, his mind already turning over the possibilities. As they turned to leave the room, the fire crackling softly behind them, there was a sense of unfinished business, a thread still dangling, waiting to be tugged at another time. The Star of Eternity may have been returned to its rightful place, but its story had only just begun.